From the time of Constantine, the Roman emperor's role in religion changed dramatically with the rise of Christianity. The emperor was no longer simply a political ruler, but also a figure expected to show deep personal devotion and moral authority. Writers of the period described Gratian as a pious ruler, and leading church figures praised both him and his brother for their religious commitment. Christian leadership claimed that Valentinian II eventually abandoned earlier beliefs influenced by his family and fully accepted Orthodox Christianity. Yet an emperor's religious responsibilities went beyond personal faith. He was expected to preserve unity within the Christian Church, defend what was seen as the true doctrine, and secure divine favour for the empire through proper religious practice. During the 4th century, Christian unity was deeply challenged by intense theological disputes. One of the most significant controversies arose from the teachings of the priest Arius, who argued that God the Father was completely indivisible and that the Son must therefore be inferior. According to this view, Christ had been created and did not share the same divine substance as the Father. These ideas caused widespread disagreement within the Church and led to numerous attempts to define official doctrine. By the time Valentinian I came to power, Christian teachings had already fragmented into competing interpretations. Earlier imperial efforts had promoted the belief that the Son was similar in nature to the Father, a compromise position that gained influence after major church councils in the mid-4th century. Since Valentinian I and his brother Valens were raised in regions where such beliefs were widespread, they may have been shaped by this environment. Valens later became strongly associated with Arianism, while Valentinian I is usually viewed as supporting the Nicene position. Although he largely avoided strict enforcement of doctrine and maintained a policy of tolerance designed to prevent unrest. Ensuring unity within the Church could involve practical actions such as issuing laws, organising councils, or settling disputes over doctrine and authority. Early in Gratian's rule, his government appeared to follow his father's cautious approach, seeking stability by balancing different religious factions, while confirming privileges already granted to the Church. One early law reaffirmed the separation between civil and ecclesiastical authority. After the catastrophic defeat of Roman forces at Adrianople, however, religious unity became an even greater concern for the government. New laws targeted certain religious groups considered disruptive, although these measures were limited and often followed earlier precedents. In the confusion following the death of Valens, an edict was issued allowing previously exiled bishops to return and granting freedom of worship to many groups. This policy of tolerance reflected the unstable condition of the Eastern Church at the time, but it was soon partially reversed, suggesting uncertainty within the imperial administration about how far religious freedom should extend. Gratian's early willingness to tolerate different Christian groups is also reflected in his decision to allow a church building in Milan to be used by followers of a theological position different from that of the Orthodox majority. This act, likely connected to the presence of influential figures at court who supported that belief, demonstrates the emperor's initial attempt to maintain balance among competing religious communities. Later developments, however, reveal a clear shift away from this cautious neutrality. Some observers attributed this change to the growing influence of the powerful Bishop Ambrose of Milan, though other factors were also significant, including the actions of Gratian's co-emperor Theodosius and the political and military pressures facing the empire. Ambrose's relationship with Gratian has often been portrayed as highly influential. The bishop produced extensive writings defending orthodox doctrine and presented them to the young emperor. Rather than being purely a response to a request for spiritual guidance, these works may have originated from an imperial demand for a clear statement of belief at a time of crisis. Gratian's court included church leaders, holding a range of views, and the emperor may have sought clarity in order to strengthen unity rather than to adopt the personal direction of a particular bishop. Although Ambrose later played a prominent role in religious affairs, claims of his early dominance over imperial policy must be treated cautiously, since most evidence for this influence comes from his own writings. Throughout Gratian's reign, many individuals and groups attempted to shape government policy, and no single figure consistently controlled imperial decisions. The movement of the imperial court to Milan increased the bishop's opportunities to influence events, and from this period his involvement in imperial religious policy becomes clearer. During these years, the emperor also supported new arrangements within the church that strengthened the authority of the Bishop of Rome in judging disputes involving clergy across the western provinces. Plans were made for broader church councils intended to resolve doctrinal disagreements throughout the empire, reflecting the emperor's traditional duty to guide religious settlement. Yet these gatherings did not unfold as originally intended. Their scope was reduced, and instead of addressing universal theological questions, they focused on specific local disputes, demonstrating how imperial policy could be shaped by the pressures of influential church leaders. By the early 380s, the government's position had clearly shifted towards strong support for Orthodox Christianity. This development was influenced not only by religious leaders in the West, but also by the firm policies of Theodosius in the Eastern Empire. The emperor's efforts to organize councils and settle religious disputes show his determination to fulfill the expectations placed upon a Christian ruler. At the same time, these actions reveal the complex interplay of political influence, personal belief, and institutional pressure within the imperial court. Christian emperors of this period were also expected to define their position toward traditional pagan practices. Gratian became particularly associated with measures directed against long-standing religious traditions in Rome. These actions included the removal of the altar of victory from the Senate House and the limitation of certain privileges long granted to traditional priesthoods. Although later accounts described these policies as sweeping and severe, modern interpretations suggest that their scope may have been more limited, affecting specific practices rather than abolishing all traditional institutions. Nevertheless, these measures provoked strong opposition from members of the Roman Senate, who remained committed to traditional religious customs. Representatives of the Senate attempted to protest these changes, but the emperor refused to receive them. Influential church leaders supported the imperial position and sought to prevent any restoration of traditional privileges. Although responsibility for initiating these policies remains uncertain, their implementation strained relations between the imperial court and sections of the Roman aristocracy. The resulting tensions demonstrate the delicate balance emperors faced between promoting Christian authority and maintaining political support among influential elites. Questions have also been raised regarding claims that Gratian rejected the traditional title associated with the chief priesthood of Roman religion. Evidence suggests that rather than completely abandoning this title, imperial authority was gradually redefined in a way that allowed traditional language to be adapted to a Christian framework. Such changes reflect the broader transformation of imperial ideology, in which religious authority remained central even as its meaning evolved. Despite these measures, Gratian's overall approach to religion often remained cautious and pragmatic. His policies must be understood within the broader expectations placed upon any Christian emperor rather than as the result of personal zeal alone. Even as church leaders sought to limit imperial involvement in ecclesiastical matters, emperors continued to assert their authority in religious affairs, demonstrating their reluctance to surrender this crucial aspect of power. The consequences of Gratian's religious policies became evident in later conflicts. Debates between defenders of traditional Roman religion and advocates of Christianity continued under his successors. Appeals for the restoration of earlier practices were rejected, reflecting the increasing importance of Christian identity in imperial authority. For rulers, particularly young or vulnerable emperors, public displays of religious commitment became an essential means of demonstrating legitimacy. This dynamic was especially visible during the reign of Valentinian II, who came to power as a child. His government became involved in a major conflict with Bishop Ambrose over control of churches in Milan. The imperial court sought to secure these buildings for its own religious ceremonies, while the bishop publicly resisted the demand. Although the emperor's mother was often blamed for promoting these policies, the actions of the court indicate the involvement of advisors concerned with preserving the authority and public image of the young ruler. At a time when Valentinian II faced serious political threats and possessed limited ability to exercise traditional imperial functions, his role as a Christian leader became central to his legitimacy. Public participation in religious ceremonies strengthened his image and encouraged loyalty among the population. Laws issued during his reign emphasized Christian observance and reinforced the impression of a ruler devoted to religious duty. The government's determination to assert control over religious spaces reveals the importance placed on the emperor's ceremonial presence and spiritual authority. The conflict with Ambrose demonstrated the limits of imperial power as well as its ambitions. The bishop's resistance challenged the government's efforts to shape religious practice, while the eventual withdrawal of imperial pressure revealed the political weakness of the regime. Nevertheless, the episode illustrates how those guiding the young emperor believed that maintaining the appearance of strong religious authority was essential to the stability of the state. In the later Roman world, a Christian emperor was expected to express his religious authority in many different ways. He could issue laws against traditional pagan practices, support the organization of the church, fund religious buildings, call councils to resolve disputes in doctrine, or demonstrate personal devotion through public acts of faith. Both Gratian and Valentinian II, in their different circumstances, attempted to fulfill these expectations. Yet the precise position of the emperor within the Christian church remained uncertain. The relationship between political authority and religious leadership was never clearly defined, and conflicts often revealed how closely the two spheres overlapped. The struggle over control of church buildings in Milan, for example, showed how difficult it could be to separate matters of faith from matters of power. Public religious ceremony also served an important political purpose. The increasing emphasis on Christian ritual during the reign of later rulers suggests that elaborate religious display often reflected political necessity rather than purely personal belief. In unstable times, visible participation in church life could strengthen a ruler's authority and reinforce loyalty. This connection between religious alliance and political survival was especially clear in the case of Valentinian II. As a young ruler facing threats to his position, his government relied heavily on cooperation with church leaders in order to reinforce the legitimacy of his rule and maintain stability. The reigns of Gratian and Valentinian II reveal that imperial advisors understood the importance of maintaining traditional expectations of rulership, even when the emperor was a child. Despite their youth, both rulers were presented as fulfilling the duties expected of any emperor. At the same time, however, new qualities began to appear among the virtues associated with imperial power. These qualities, often shaped by Christian ideals, would have seemed unusual if applied to mature rulers. They were particularly emphasized in descriptions of Valentinian II and reflected a developing strategy to make the rule of a child seem natural and convincing. These newly celebrated virtues included humility, innocence, gentleness, and moral purity. Gratian was praised for his devotion, kindness, and spiritual discipline. Both brothers were described as possessing extraordinary simplicity and moral clarity, their character compared to symbols of gentleness and innocence. Valentinian II, despite his young age, was portrayed as possessing wisdom beyond his years and remarkable self-control. His calm temperament and peaceful disposition were credited with protecting the empire and preserving stability in times of danger. Such praise emphasized not strength or military power, but moral virtue and spiritual innocence. The celebration of innocence and gentleness in an emperor would have been unexpected under ordinary circumstances. These qualities reflected the unique position of a child ruler. Youth itself became a source of legitimacy, as the purity of a young emperor was believed to attract divine favor and protection for the state. The vulnerability of a boy on the throne could be transformed into a symbol of sacred authority. Yet reality didn't always support such claims, and the reigns of both Gratian and Valentinian II were marked by significant challenges that made divine protection difficult to demonstrate. Youth could also serve as a convenient explanation for political decisions. It could excuse actions or limitations when necessary, while at other times it was presented as evidence of exceptional promise. A young emperor's age might be cited to justify his inability to perform certain tasks, yet the same youth could be portrayed as no obstacle to moral responsibility. Religious leaders could insist that spiritual maturity did not depend on years and that even a child ruler must be held accountable for his actions. Age, therefore, became a flexible element in imperial representation, used either to defend or to elevate the emperor according to circumstance. This dual image created a striking paradox. A young ruler could be described simultaneously as both child and father of the state, combining vulnerability with authority. Such a balance proved difficult to sustain in practice. The effort to present these rulers as fully capable while acknowledging their youth reveals the challenges faced by those attempting to legitimize their power. Religious ceremony played a central role in shaping the public image of a child emperor. In many parts of the empire, the presence of the emperor was represented through statues, portraits, and public appearances. A young ruler could easily fulfill such symbolic functions. Participation in processions, religious festivals, and public rituals allowed the emperor to embody imperial authority even when real power lay elsewhere. Written works praising the emperor's character reinforced this image, emphasizing education, moral discipline, wisdom, and purity. These portrayals highlighted promise and potential when actual achievements were limited. Claims about military ability, judicial competence, and religious authority were also made on behalf of young rulers, though the practical demands of governing an empire made such claims difficult to sustain. The reality of imperial administration required experience and authority that a child could rarely possess. Contemporary observers may not always have believed the idealized image presented by official rhetoric, recognizing the gap between representation and reality. In practice, power often rested in the hands of advisors and military leaders who governed in the emperor's name. Valentinian II, even as he grew older, exercised limited independent authority, while key decisions were shaped by powerful figures within his government. Gratian's situation differed in some respects, yet his failure to maintain the loyalty of his army suggests that real influence frequently lay with those commanding military support rather than with the emperor himself. The development of complex administrative systems and elaborate court ceremony made it possible for a child to occupy the imperial throne, but these structures could not fully compensate for the challenges of leadership. The demands of governing required skills and experience that symbolic authority alone could not provide. Some observers suggested that while Gratian possessed many admirable qualities, he lacked practical understanding of how to rule effectively. Certain imperial responsibilities, such as presiding over ceremonies or administering justice, could be adapted to the limitations of a young ruler. The military role of the emperor, however, remained difficult to reconcile with childhood. Many of the political difficulties faced by these regimes arose from expectations that the emperor should lead armies and defend the state in person. As new methods developed to support and represent child emperors, new challenges also emerged, particularly when these rulers reached adulthood. The transition from symbolic authority to genuine power proved especially complex. When a child emperor matured and attempted to assert independence, tensions often arose with those who had previously governed in his name. Both Gratian and Valentinian II appear to have encountered such struggles. Each sought to exercise military authority in early adulthood, and both efforts ended tragically. These events reveal the instability created when a ceremonial ruler attempted to transform himself into an active political leader. Despite these difficulties, strategies for managing the limitations of child rule continued to develop. Emphasis on youthful promise was combined with increased reliance on ceremony and religious authority. The young emperor's role as a sacred and symbolic figure became central to the functioning of imperial government. This model would influence later reigns, where ceremonial presence and religious legitimacy increasingly defined imperial power. Gratian's accession at a very young age established an important precedent. His reign marked a turning point in the development of the Roman imperial office. Although he initially attempted to assume the traditional role of a military ruler, later emperors who came to power as children would not follow this path. In the decades that followed, military leadership was increasingly exercised by generals rather than by emperors themselves. Imperial authority became more closely associated with ceremonial representation and religious function. From this period onward, the public image of the emperor emphasized spiritual leadership and ritual authority. The emperor's role as a Christian ruler moved to the forefront of political life, shaping both the structure of government and the expectations of society. The experiences of Gratian and Valentinian II demonstrated that while the boundaries of imperial power could be expanded to accommodate a child ruler, significant challenges remained. Over time, one method proved especially useful for making child rule workable in the Western Empire, turning the imperial office into something increasingly ceremonial. That long-term shift created a clear contrast with earlier periods of Roman history, when even youthful rulers were expected to be visibly active in government and war. At first glance, two boy emperors in quick succession might be dismissed as an accident of politics, and the solutions built around them might look improvised. Yet what followed made it obvious that something deeper was happening. The later reigns of Honorius and Valentinian III did not simply repeat the earlier pattern. They pushed child emperor rule into a new phase, reshaping court politics and the workings of government. These later developments did not appear out of nowhere, however. Their foundations were laid during the earlier experiments of Gratian and Valentinian II. Up to this point, the story has been easier to understand by focusing on themes. The expectations placed on emperors, the ways rulers were presented to the public, and the methods used by advisors to compensate for a ruler's age. But the reigns that come next in the Western Empire demand a different approach. Honorius and Valentinian III ruled far longer, and the sequence of events around them is complicated, filled with shifting alliances, internal rivalries, and repeated challenges to authority. To see how child rule became normalized, it helps to track events in order and watch the system evolve step by step. Within just 2 years of Valentinian II's troubled end, the West accepted another child as emperor, Honorius, only 10 years old. Ancient writers and many later historians treated him as unimpressive, sometimes mocking him as slow-witted or politically useless. He does not dominate the surviving narratives the way earlier emperors did, and he often appears as a distant figure while others act around him. That absence creates a problem for anyone trying to reconstruct his personality or decisions. Yet, it also makes his reign revealing. Honorius remained emperor in the West from 395 until 423, surviving crises that destroyed other rulers. His court endured invasions, sieges, rebellions, civil conflicts, family scandals, and long-term financial strain. He outlasted more dramatic figures and remained on the throne longer than any Roman emperor since Constantine. Even if later writers dismissed him, powerful people in the Western Empire clearly saw benefit in keeping him in place, first as a child and later as an adult. His endurance forces a basic question. How did the late Roman state adapt to a ruler who could be preserved, protected, and used as the centerpiece of power while others fought over real control? Honorius's reign offers a key to the broader phenomenon, because it is during his era that the framework around child rule becomes easier to see. Different groups of ministers and generals took turns dominating the court, and each group developed its own way of presenting and managing the emperor. The most important point is not simply which faction won at a given moment, but what these struggles reveal about the system itself. The political culture of the West was learning how to keep a child emperor on the throne as a stable symbol, even when events were unstable. Tracking the timeline matters, because the story becomes dense and confusing, especially in the later years, when the empire was shaken by repeated rebellions and rival claimants. The difficulties of studying Honorius are made worse by the nature of the sources. There is no complete, continuous Western narrative for the period. What survives is scattered, sometimes detailed, sometimes vague, often inconsistent. Much of the best chronological structure comes from partial accounts, written from an Eastern perspective and from a later historian who recorded the period with uneven clarity. Even so, enough survives to piece together a clear outline, and without that outline, the political chaos of the years after 408 becomes nearly impossible to follow. Honorius also brings the transition problem into sharp focus. What happens when a child emperor grows up? Earlier, boy emperors did not live long enough to settle that question. Honorius did. His reign lasted almost twice as long as the reigns of Gratian or Valentinian II, suggesting that techniques for managing child rule were improving. It also suggests that the state was finding ways to deal with the awkward moment when a figure raised as a ceremonial ruler reached adulthood. Child rule could never become a stable model until this issue was handled, because the earlier examples had shown how dangerous the transition could be. Even though the earlier reigns ended badly, they still altered assumptions about what the imperial office could be. They proved that the throne could be occupied by a minor if the surrounding structures were strong enough. The early years of Honorius show how this new model was launched. They reveal the careful planning that prepared his rise, the political maneuvering that shaped his government after his father's death, and the methods used to present his rule as legitimate. The central point is that Honorius's long survival changed the political culture of the Western Empire. It made child emperors, and ceremonial emperors more generally, feel normal. It helped create a working arrangement in which the emperor could be treated like a dependent figure even after reaching adult age, while power was exercised by managers around him. Honorius was born on the 9th of September, 384 in Constantinople, the younger son of Theodosius I and his first wife, Aelia Flacilla. From the start, Theodosius treated dynastic succession as a political project. His elder son, Arcadius, already held the senior imperial rank by this time. Honorius, still an infant, received prestigious titles designed to mark him out as a prince of the dynasty. He was also given public honours at an astonishingly young age, including an early consulship. All meant to place him in the public eye and establish him as a legitimate heir. These gestures were not empty ceremony. They were part of a broader strategy to lock the future of the West to Theodosius's family. After defeating the usurper, Magnus Maximus, Theodosius summoned Honorius from Constantinople to the west. The journey itself was a statement. The emperor wanted the Roman world to see his child. Honorius arrived during victory celebrations at Rome, a moment carefully chosen for maximum impact. The reigning Western emperor, Valentinian II, did not appear in those celebrations, and that absence mattered. Theodosius used the occasion to elevate Honorius to a lower rank that still clearly marked him as the next Western ruler. It was a deliberate public message to the Roman aristocracy. The West's future was being redirected toward Theodosius's own line. This gradual promotion was itself revealing. Theodosius could have elevated Honorius straight to the highest rank, as had happened with several earlier heirs. Instead, he advanced the boy step by step. That slower approach likely reflected political realities. Valentinian II was still alive, and Arcadius already held senior rank. A more cautious move allowed Theodosius to prepare the ground without creating immediate constitutional tension inside the Imperial College. Even so, the symbolism was unmistakable. Honorius was displayed to the Roman public as the heir-in-waiting, and coinage issued around the celebrations carried slogans emphasizing hope for the state, reinforcing the idea that the dynasty embodied the empire's future. Only a few years later, events in the West forced the issue. Another usurper appeared and Theodosius prepared to move against him. Before leaving on campaign, he raised Honorius to the highest rank in a major public ceremony near Constantinople. Honorius was now, at the age of 7, an emperor in name. The timing was a political weapon. It directly challenged the legitimacy of the usurper by placing a dynastic child in the Western role. It also signalled that Theodosius intended the West to be ruled by his bloodline, not by whoever seized power through force. After winning the civil war in 394, Theodosius again brought Honorius west. That decision would have made sense even if the senior emperor expected to live for years. The boy had already been announced as the Western ruler, and the Western elite needed to see him. Honorius arrived with his half-sister Galla Placidia, and their presence together served a second purpose. Placidia connected the Theodosian court to the earlier Valentinian dynasty through her family ties, and her inclusion helped frame the new regime as a continuation rather than a rupture. Theodosius welcomed his children in Milan with a carefully staged religious setting, presenting the moment as more than politics. Public church ritual was used to add sacred weight to the transfer of authority and to emphasize that the dynasty stood under divine favor. Even after victory, Theodosius likely intended to return east once the west was stabilized, because problems were building there during his absence. But he had only a short time between his victory and his death to shape the new Western administration. Later accounts claim that he formally confirmed Honorius's role in the West and placed the general Stilicho in a position of authority beside him. Whether this arrangement was fully planned in advance or became clearer only after Theodosius's death, one fact remains. The West now had a 10-year-old emperor, and it required an adult power structure to govern in his name. Stilicho was well placed to step into that space. He was tied to the ruling family by marriage, experienced in war, and present in the West at the crucial moment. Yet the situation was not as simple as later propaganda made it appear. It is uncertain how much authority Theodosius truly intended Stilicho to exercise. The senior emperor had seen what happened when powerful generals dominated young rulers. He might have hesitated to leave his son in the hands of another strongman. At the same time, Honorius was too young to govern alone, and someone had to hold the state together. The elder emperor died in January 395. The story that later circulated claimed that Theodosius, in his final moments, entrusted Stilicho with the care of both of his sons, not just Honorius, but also Arcadius in the east. That claim would become politically important, because it would allow Stilicho to present himself as the guardian of the whole dynasty and the defender of imperial unity. Yet there are reasons to doubt how early or how genuine this story was. The earliest texts, produced immediately after Theodosius's death, did not clearly endorse Stilicho's sweeping claims. The story appears more firmly only later, in a public speech composed for political purposes, suggesting it may have been crafted to strengthen Stilicho's position after he had already begun consolidating power. In the West, Stilicho moved quickly. He established a model that went beyond what earlier managers of boy emperors had achieved. Rather than simply serving as a leading general, he positioned himself as the indispensable partner of the emperor, the adult guardian who would guide the legitimate child ruler. His marriage connection to the dynasty gave him a powerful advantage, and he used it to anchor his authority more firmly than predecessors who had tried to control young emperors without such family ties. Modern language often calls this arrangement a regency, but in Roman terms there was no formal office like that. Stilicho could be described as the child's guardian in a legal sense, yet guardianship did not automatically grant control of government. His power depended on court politics, military support, and the ability to shape public perception. This mattered because it meant his authority, especially early on, could have been more fragile than later narratives suggested. The new system had to be built, defended, and presented as natural. A revealing window into the uncertainty of those first months comes from the funeral oration delivered for Theodosius in Milan. The bishop who spoke sought to stabilize the transition, but the speech did not openly celebrate Stilicho or even name him. That omission is striking. If Stilicho's dominance had been universally accepted from the start, public endorsement from such a powerful church figure would have been valuable. Instead, the oration focused on loyalty to Honorius himself. The message was aimed at a mixed audience: soldiers from rival armies recently at war, officials who had served earlier regimes, and elites who had lived through multiple usurpations. The priority was to secure unity around the child emperor and to bind support to the memory of Theodosius. The speech used ceremony and sacred language to frame the new emperor's legitimacy. Honorius appeared in a privileged religious setting, presented as a ruler marked out by divine favour. The oration emphasized that the boy's weakness in years was compensated by the strength of those who supported him. It argued that the late emperor lived on through his sons, and that loyalty owed to the father must now be paid to the heirs. The idea was clear: the army and the court must not treat age as an excuse for disobedience. The speech also connected Honorius to earlier legitimate Western rulers, constructing an image of dynastic continuity that stretched backward through the empire's recent past. That connection was not simply decorative. It was meant to reassure the Western elite that the new regime belonged to the recognized line of emperors and should therefore be accepted. The urgency behind these messages reveals the fear beneath the ritual. Only months earlier, the empire had been torn by civil war. The Western army had supported multiple rebel emperors in recent years. Now Theodosius was dead. the West had a child on the throne, and the possibility of another round of rebellion was real. Why should soldiers follow a boy who could not lead them in battle? The oration's repeated appeals for loyalty were not abstract theology. They were political necessity. Divine favour was used as an argument for obedience, and recent victories were presented as proof that betrayal would be punished. This was a public attempt to bind military power to a child emperor through memory, ritual, and fear of the consequences of disloyalty. Another theme was pushed just as hard as loyalty: mercy. The message was aimed not only at soldiers, but at the civilian power structure of the Western Empire as well. In Milan, it was stressed that Theodosius had been a ruler who took pleasure in forgiving enemies and sparing the defeated. The audience was assured that promises of pardon made under his authority would not suddenly be withdrawn now that he was gone. The reason for repeating this point was simple. The civil war had ended only months earlier, and a great many men in uniform and in office, along with influential senators, had served the losing side under Eugenius. They needed to know whether the new regime intended to punish them or bring them back into the system. The language of clemency was meant to calm panic, prevent further instability, and encourage those compromised by the rebellion to attach themselves to the boy emperor rather than look for a new gamble. This promise of forgiveness did not remain only a public performance. It was followed by practical measures that made the new government's position clear. Early laws issued from Milan confirmed that decisions made by judges during the usurper's rule would still stand, which protected property transfers, court verdicts, and administrative actions from being unravelled. Soon after, broader guarantees were issued to reassure those who had served in administrative or honorary roles during the rebellion. Many were promised that they would not lose social rank for having held office under the previous regime. In effect, the government was telling the Western establishment that cooperation would not lead to ruin. At the same time, such laws reveal something important about the situation. They were not the actions of a regime confident enough to rule through fear alone. This was a government that needed former opponents to accept its authority, and that necessity shaped policy. These pardons created a pattern of mutual dependency. The new court needed experienced Western officials and senators to stabilize administration and finance. The Western elite, embarrassed by its recent choices and uncertain of its future, needed protection and rehabilitation. This dynamic helped strengthen the position of Honorius's chief manager. A powerful mediator in Milan could offer a route back into favour, and many senators were eager to secure that route. A direct relationship with the boy emperor was difficult to build in such conditions. A relationship with the adult figure controlling access to the throne was far more practical. The results can be seen in the careers of individual aristocrats. Men who had been associated with the rebel regime were not only forgiven, but later restored to high office, sometimes without even being required to repay salaries earned during the rebellion. Some returned to prominence within a few years, including appointments in Rome that carried enormous prestige. The Imperial Court's decision to base itself in Milan also mattered. With the government no longer isolated in a distant northern residence, Roman senators could appear in person, attend ceremonies, and maintain visibility at court. Letters exchanged between leading senators and the commander who dominated the Western government show how actively these figures pursued cordial ties. The relationship was not sentimental. It was political insurance. The administration was also built through carefully chosen appointments that signalled continuity. A number of officials called into service under Honorius had long careers stretching back into earlier reigns. Their presence reassured the Western establishment that the new government was not a foreign takeover, even though the emperor and several key figures around him had Eastern backgrounds. experienced administrators were valuable not only for competence, but for symbolism. Their names represented stability, tradition, and familiarity, exactly what was needed after a civil war and the sudden death of the senior emperor. At the same time, Eastern-born officials also appeared in high posts in the West after 395. That, too, reflected the reality of the transition. Theodosius had brought a limited portion of his court apparatus west for the campaign, and the situation after his death required a functioning government immediately. Some officials with careers in Eastern administration were therefore drawn into Western service, perhaps to ensure loyalty to the dynasty and to provide the expertise needed to keep finance and palace operations running. But this choice also exposed a weakness. If the new Western regime had been fully secure, it would not have needed to rely on imported bureaucratic support at the highest levels. Giving major roles to Eastern officials could be read as an incentive to keep them attached to the Western court, and as a way to reinforce the manager's control over the system. The army was another urgent concern. The recent conflict had drained manpower, and the government's early legislation shows a sharp focus on numbers and discipline. Measures were taken to increase recruitment even from imperial estates, to punish desertion, and to protect provincials from men claiming military status in order to extort supplies. Once the Eastern Field Army withdrew back toward Constantinople, the West needed to rebuild its own strength and stabilize the relationship between soldiers and civilians, especially in regions exposed to attack. The emphasis was practical. Keep the army filled, keep it fed without letting it prey on the population, and reduce the risk of mutiny or independent action. Public messaging continued to target the army as well. Court poets and official speech writers amplified the emotional appeal already heard in Milan. Loyalty to the father should transfer to loyalty to the son. The boy emperor was placed in scenes meant to imply deep, almost instinctive connection to the military world. Images of him among the soldiers as a child, eager to follow campaigns, raised within the culture of the army. Even years later, the propaganda still carried the shadow of civil war. Speeches imagined for the young emperor urged troops to cleanse the empire's wounds through new victories, as if the stain of recent conflict still lingered on the army's identity. In one especially revealing dramatic scene, the dead Theodosius is pictured acknowledging that he left disorder behind, a turmoil that barely could have been managed even by an experienced ruler, let alone under a child's authority. Whether or not such scenes were invented for effect, they captured an atmosphere that likely felt real to contemporaries. The war was over, but the aftershocks were not. Religious policy was also used to reinforce the regime's image. Early laws confirmed that church privileges granted by earlier emperors would remain intact. Later measures again emphasized protection for ecclesiastical authority, including special recognition for the Bishop of Rome. Such actions were conventional, but in this context they carried extra weight. They signaled continuity with legitimate Christian rule, promised stability to church leaders, and framed the boy emperor's government as not merely lawful but blessed. A striking episode from Milan shows how closely church and court cooperation could be staged as a public sign of divine favour. A martyr's body was said to have been discovered in the city and reburied with great ceremony in a major church. The event became a showcase of alliance. The shrine was decorated through an expensive donation associated with the ruling circle, and prayers were offered for the safe return of the empire's leading commander, who was away on campaign. The scene was carefully arranged to communicate shared purpose. The church offered sacred authority and public legitimacy, while the court provided patronage, protection, and resources. The symbolism mattered. Earlier in Milan's recent past, the discovery of martyrs had been used as a weapon against an imperial court. Now, a similar kind of miracle narrative could be presented as favour resting on the new government instead, linking the boy emperor's regime to sacred approval rather than conflict. This relationship benefited both sides. For the bishop, the court's presence in Milan created access and influence that would have been harder to achieve if the government had remained far away. For the men steering the young emperor's rule, the bishop's support offered something priceless: recognition that the regime was not only politically valid, but spiritually legitimate. In a world where authority was increasingly expressed through ritual, such endorsement mattered as much as armies and titles. Looking back, it can be tempting to describe the early years as a smoothly functioning partnership between the Roman aristocracy, the military leadership at court, and the church in Milan. Yet the need for broad pardons, the anxious tone of early public speeches, and the heavy reliance on sacred language show that stability was not automatic. The government had to win support from people who had very recently backed a rival emperor, and it had to do so while placing a 10-year-old at the centre of the system. That required reassurance, incentives, and an image powerful enough to compensate for the child's inability to act like the emperors of the past. When Honorius became Western Emperor in 395 at the age of 10, a new political arrangement solidified around him. The real engine of power was the General Stilicho, officially the boy's guardian, and, in practice, the figure who directed the Western government for more than a decade. Over the next 13 years, he fought wars in the emperor's name, scored a few highly publicized successes, collected honors that were normally reserved for the imperial family, and tied his household to the throne through marriage. He built his position so confidently that he could imagine a future in which a grandchild of his might one day inherit the empire through Honorius's line. And yet, after standing at the center of Western rule for so long, Stilicho ended his career in 408 by accepting an execution ordered by the very emperor he had raised and controlled. The long rise and sudden collapse of this arrangement reveals what guardianship actually meant in late Roman politics, how it was justified, and how hard it became to sustain once a child emperor started to become an adult. The key to Stilicho's authority was not only his command of soldiers, but the way the emperor himself was packaged for the public. Honorius was presented as a legitimate, pious ruler whose sacred standing could guarantee victory, even if he never personally led an army. That image was repeated year after year through speeches, ceremonies, and carefully crafted narratives. It allowed the court to project a partnership, a young emperor who embodied divine favour and dynastic right, and a guardian general who supplied experience, military muscle, and administrative direction. That formula worked best, while Honorius was clearly a minor. The real test came as the years passed and the boy moved toward adulthood. The harder question was no longer how to govern for a child, but how to keep the emperor dependent when he was no longer a child. In the first years after the accession, the Western government faced immediate pressure from two directions. One problem came from the Visigoths, led by Alaric. The other came from the Eastern court, whose leaders were suspicious of the new Western power structure and increasingly hostile to Stilicho's ambitions. Alaric's forces had fought alongside Theodosius's army during the Civil War, but early in 395 they broke away and began raiding through Greece. The rebellion created a crisis that demanded action, and Stilicho moved as if he were responsible for the security of the entire empire, not merely the West. In 395 and again in 397, he campaigned against the Visigoths. In both cases, he failed to deliver the decisive victory that would have crushed Alaric and ended the threat. That failure shaped everything that followed, because it weakened the image of competence the new regime needed, and it gave Eastern leaders an excuse to treat Stilicho as dangerous rather than helpful. The first expedition in 395 was especially complicated because the forces available to Stilicho included not only Western troops, but also an Eastern contingent that had remained in the West after the death of Theodosius. In later Western propaganda, the story was told as a near triumph, sabotaged at the last moment by the jealous politics of the Eastern capital. According to that version, Stilicho had Alaric trapped and was about to destroy him when orders arrived, demanding that the Eastern soldiers be returned immediately. The blame was placed on influential figures around the Eastern Emperor, portrayed as frightened of Stilicho's growing prestige and determined to block him from gaining leverage over the Eastern government. In that telling, Stilicho supposedly chose obedience over victory, withdrew, and watched the opportunity slip away. A calmer reading of events suggests a less dramatic and more practical problem. The campaign likely suffered from poor discipline and shaky loyalty inside the army. The order to send back Eastern units could then serve as a convenient reason to end a dangerous operation without admitting that the army itself was unreliable. Whatever the true details, the outcome was the same. Alaric survived, the West looked ineffective, and relations with the East worsened. After a renewed recruiting effort, Stilicho tried again in 397, but the second expedition also failed to produce a decisive result. Rumours later circulated that he must have been colluding with Alaric, but that logic does not fit the political reality. These operations were expensive, risky, and humiliating when they achieved little. A deliberate failure would have damaged Stilicho's authority in exactly the places he could least afford to lose it, among soldiers, senators, and the wider political class that expected him to deliver security. The deeper issue was that the Western army was still adjusting to a new reality. Many of these soldiers had recently faced Eastern forces in a civil war, and now they were expected to serve under a commander closely associated with the victors. Memories of the brutal fighting remained fresh. Stilicho also carried the burden of trying to follow the legacy of a victorious emperor whose reputation had been built on personal command in war. Now, the West was being asked to accept a government led by an adult general in the name of an emperor who was still largely invisible on campaign because he was a child. That combination was workable, but it made loyalty more fragile. Every setback invited doubt, and every doubt made the Guardian's position less secure. Eastern hostility did not remain a background tension. It hardened into policy. The loss of Eastern troops reduced Stilicho's strength at a critical moment, and it also signalled that the Eastern court intended to set limits on Western action. By 397, the Eastern government had moved beyond suspicion to open hostility, treating Stilicho's military activity as a threat and choosing to reach its own accommodation with Alaric. At the same time, the East formally branded Stilicho as a public enemy, a political insult with real consequences. The message was clear. The Eastern court would rather bargain with the Goths than allow the Western Guardian to appear as the Empire's saviour. In fact, the aftermath may have strengthened Stilicho's standing. Events in the East soon made Western elites feel even more distinct, especially when Eastern politics elevated figures and practices that many in the West regarded as offensive to traditional dignity. Western propaganda made full use of that contrast, celebrating Western office holding and aristocratic prestige, and presenting the Western court as the proper guardian of Roman order. The court's ability to honour respected senators with high office served the same purpose. It signalled that the new regime valued the Western elite and could reward it. For Stilicho, the lesson of these early years was sharp. External threats could be defeated, but his own position depended on a far more delicate balance. The army's loyalty, the Senate's cooperation, the church's public support, and the continued dependency of the emperor. Honorius was still young, but time was passing. Legal guardianship did not last forever, and the moment would come when a teenage emperor could claim a more active role. The most effective way to prevent that shift was to bind the guardian's household to the dynasty so tightly that the relationship could not be undone without shaking the regime itself. That here is the context for Honorius's first marriage. Early in 398, when Honorius was about 13, he married Stilicho's eldest daughter, Maria. The timing was telling. The wedding took place before news of Gildo's defeat could even have reached the court, which suggests that the decision was not a victory celebration, but a defensive move made under pressure. The marriage locked Stilicho into the imperial family and transformed his status. A guardian could be replaced when a boy grew older. A father-in-law was harder to push aside, especially when the stability of the court depended on the network that guardian had built. The marriage was designed to extend influence beyond childhood, to keep the emperor close, and to make the manager behind the throne appear not merely necessary, but almost familial and permanent. In the late 390s, Honorius was still barely a teenager, yet the Western Empire already revolved around him. The real weight of government, however, rested on Stilicho. He commanded armies, negotiated with elites, managed crises, and steadily shaped the public image of the boy on the throne. By the time the war in Africa erupted and food security became a threat, Stilicho's position was clear. He wasn't merely a general serving an emperor, but the person holding the Western state together while the emperor grew up. In that climate, the marriage between Honorius and Stilicho's daughter Maria became more than a domestic event. It was turned into a public statement about stability, legitimacy, and the future of the dynasty. Court poetry celebrated the wedding with elaborate ceremonial language, painting the match as honourable, fated, and politically safe. One version of the story insisted that the plan had existed even before Theodosius died, as if the late emperor himself had designed the union. In this telling, the timing looked less like an emergency decision and more like the completion of an earlier strategy. The young bride's age was acknowledged indirectly, and the narrative leaned instead on the idea of youthful devotion and proper intention, presenting the emperor as eager for a lawful marriage and the guardian as hesitant only out of protective caution. Even if the arrangement had been considered earlier, the danger posed by the African crisis gave the decision sharper urgency. If the grain supply could be weaponized, then the survival of the regime depended on preventing isolation at court, preventing factions from circling the emperor, and preventing any rival from becoming indispensable. Marriage did what victories sometimes could not. It fused households. It placed Stilicho inside the imperial family in a way that could not be dismissed as a temporary guardianship. A guardian could be replaced when a boy matured. A father-in-law stood on different ground, closer to the throne by bloodline and ceremony, and harder to remove without shaking the court itself. The propaganda around the wedding did more than praise romance or virtue. It openly promoted the logic of dependence. The message was subtle but persistent. Loyalty to the young emperor was strengthened by the deeds of the man attached to him. The emperor's authority remained sacred and dynastic, but the guardian's achievements became the practical proof that the regime deserved support. The underlying hope, never far from the surface, was succession. If an heir were born from this marriage, Stilicho would no longer be merely the emperor's manager. He would become the grandfather of a future emperor, and the political structure of the West would be anchored to his house. As the years passed, the same voice that celebrated the wedding also pushed the fantasy further. Public praise began imagining children, not yet conceived, heirs already growing, and a future ruler trained in war by a seasoned elder. This kind of language was not accidental decoration. It was a deliberate attempt to normalize the idea that power in the West functioned through a paired system. A legitimate emperor at the center and an adult protector beside him. That pairing had to remain believable long enough for it to become habit. The marriage also encouraged another dynastic possibility, discussed in flattering tones. Linking Stilicho's son to Honorius's half-sister, Galla Placidia. Such a match would have served two purposes. It would have deepened the family bond around the imperial house, and it would have reduced the risk that Placidia might become the key to a rival faction through marriage to someone else. In a court where marriage could shift alliances overnight, controlling the marriage market around imperial women was a form of political defense. All of this reveals something essential about Stilicho's method. Military action mattered, but proximity to the emperor mattered more. During the African crisis, a general could have chased personal glory by leading the expedition himself. Instead, Stilicho remained near the court, near Honorius, keeping the young ruler insulated from competing councillors and building a relationship that could survive beyond childhood. The priority was not simply defeating enemies, it was keeping the architecture of power intact at home. At the same time, the court worked hard to craft a convincing imperial image for Honorius. Earlier, the opening of the reign had been framed around a simple formula: the greatness of the father, the legitimacy of the son, and the promise of the boy's future. That promise had to be renewed repeatedly, because promise was often the only available substitute for action. The court's poets supplied a steady stream of scenes designed to make a child look like a complete emperor. Honorius's birth and status were used as proof that he belonged on the throne. He was portrayed as a prince who had never lived as a private citizen, raised in an atmosphere of authority from the beginning, surrounded by ceremonies and honors that marked him as imperial by nature. The story made much of early titles and early public offices, emphasizing that the state had recognized him, almost from the cradle. Omens, blessings, and comparisons to the gods appeared in this imagery, not because anyone expected literal belief from every listener, but because such language trained the audience to accept the boy as destined, not accidental. Education was another pillar of the presentation. The boy emperor was described as shaped by culture and guided toward virtue, learning stories of Roman heroes and absorbing lessons about government. Speeches attributed to him were polished and confident, suitable for major ceremonies. The point was not whether a teenager truly authored such speeches, but whether the court could make the performance convincing. Eloquence was part of authority. So was calmness. So was the appearance of understanding. The most difficult problem, however, was military virtue. In a Roman world shaped for centuries by campaigning emperors, an emperor who did not lead armies had to be defended by imagination. The solution was to emphasize training and future readiness rather than direct command. The boy was pictured among soldiers as a child, surrounded by standards, weapons, and trophies as if war were his natural environment. Tales were invented or embellished to show him reaching for helmets, handling spears, longing to ride with the army. The message was clear. The desire was there. The spirit was there. And adulthood would complete what youth postponed. This presentation was paired with stories of a strict father shaping a future commander. The late emperor was described as discouraging softness, pushing the boy to endure heat and cold, to practice physical hardship, to ride, to throw weapons, to master the discipline of a camp. The advice attributed to the father often sounded like a handbook, for an ideal ruler, respect soldiers, share their hardships, understand formations, and lead by presence. Whether such lessons were ever delivered exactly as described was less important than the purpose they served. They reassured an anxious elite that the imperial household understood what an emperor was supposed to be. Where military reality could not be supplied by the emperor himself, the narrative shifted to other virtues: justice, restraint, generosity, and a civil style of rule. The boy was presented as moderate rather than cruel, lawful rather than arbitrary, generous but not wasteful, a ruler whose government ended fear and confiscations, whose reign did not depend on terror. These were safe virtues for a young emperor because they were difficult to disprove and easy to celebrate. Yet a striking change emerged as this propaganda matured. The virtues of rulership were no longer assigned to Honorius alone. They were increasingly assigned to Stilicho as well. In fact, the court's public messaging began to treat Stilicho almost like an emperor in everything but title. He was praised for endurance in winter camps, for tireless labour, for personal bravery, for inspiring troops, for frightening enemies, and for bringing victory where the state had despaired. He was also praised for qualities beyond the battlefield: patience, prudence, fairness, respect for tradition, and the ability to counsel and govern. The portrait was that of a complete ruler. This was not an accidental compliment to a powerful minister. It was the logic of the regime made public. A child emperor needed someone else to carry the active burdens of state, especially in war. Praising that person as a near imperial hero made the arrangement feel natural. It reminded the audience who distributed offices and rewards, who negotiated with elites, and who truly directed decisions. And it wrapped that reality in a language of loyalty. The guardian was not a rival, but the protector of the dynasty. The relationship was therefore framed as a partnership. The emperor embodied legitimacy, sacred authority, and the future. The guardian embodied action, competence, and present security. This pairing was repeated in multiple settings. Embassies received, treaties signed, barbarian groups answered, and public ceremonies staged, with the suggestion that the emperor's authority remained central even when the guardian performed the work. The guardian appeared as teacher and adoptive father, combining deference with guidance, honouring the emperor publicly while shaping decisions behind the curtain. In that partnership, even absence could be turned into power. Foreign peoples were said to swear loyalty to an emperor they rarely saw, because the guardian's march and reputation stood in for the imperial presence. Victories won by the general were recast as triumphs, placed on the emperor's brow. When the guardian held office, the message implied that the emperor had extended himself through him, giving the city a consul who served as a substitute for the absent ruler. It was a carefully built illusion of continuity. The emperor's dignity never left the centre, even when the emperor did not personally act. This is what made the marriage so important. It was not merely an alliance of households, it was a reinforcement of the partnership model itself. It prolonged dependency at the moment when dependency was supposed to fade. It made the guardian's presence look permanent rather than provisional, and it invested political hope in biology, the dream of an heir who would merge the imperial house and the guardian's line, transforming a powerful minister into the ancestor of a ruling dynasty. For a time, the system held. It survived setbacks against the Goths. It survived tensions with the East. It survived the African crisis. It even turned these dangers into public proof that the guardian's leadership was necessary and effective. But the strategy contained its own fatal weakness. The more completely the guardian's role was normalized, the more threatening it could become to an emperor who eventually wanted to rule in his own name. A child emperor could be protected and shaped. an adult emperor could resent being managed. The partnership that looked stable in the 390s could become unbearable later, because it depended on the emperor accepting a secondary role in his own government. In 404, the Western court staged a spectacle meant to convince Rome that order had returned. Honorius entered the city to mark his consulship, and the public image was carefully managed. The emperor appeared not as an isolated ruler, but as one half of a governing pair. Stilicho rode beside him in the same ceremonial chariot, a gesture loaded with meaning. It echoed earlier triumphal entrances associated with the dynasty, where a child or young prince had been displayed alongside a senior figure whose presence guaranteed authority. The symbolism was blunt. The emperor carried legitimacy, while the general supplied the strength that made that legitimacy workable. Private correspondence from Rome's elite hints that this was not lost on anyone who mattered. Symmachus, one of the best-connected aristocrats of the age, addressed Stilicho in language that sounded closer to imperial honorifics than to ordinary official praise. He repeatedly framed him as a public parent, the kind of phrase that evoked the old idea of an emperor as the father of the country. Other compliments piled up in the same register, treating him as a towering figure defined by every kind of virtue. These were not just flourishes of politeness. They reveal a problem at the heart of the system. There was no formal title for what Stilicho had become. He was far more than a commander-in-chief. He was more than a legal guardian. In practice, he functioned as the regime's anchor, and people reached for imperial language to describe a role the constitution did not clearly name. This kind of shared presentation had not been developed so fully under earlier boy emperors. Gratian and Valentinian II had advisors and generals, but the structure around Honorius was more ambitious. Stilicho also had advantages his predecessors lacked. He was bound to the ruling house through marriage, and he stayed in place for years, long enough to refine the machinery of government and propaganda. He also had a grim set of lessons available. He had watched what happened to other child rulers, and to the men who tried to control them. Survival required both performance and constant adaptation. Yet time created a pressure that no ceremonial could remove. The court relied heavily on the notion of promise. At the beginning, the idea that a youthful ruler would one day become the kind of emperor tradition demanded could be sold plausibly. A decade later, it became harder. Youth stops being an excuse when childhood is gone. The problem did not disappear in the public messaging, at least not in the evidence that survives. Even into the early 5th century, the imagery stayed remarkably consistent. Honorius remained the bright young figure whose future greatness justified loyalty, while Stilicho continued to supply the deeds. The widening gap between image and reality became sharper once military danger returned to Italy. In 401, Alaric's forces pushed into the peninsula. The fighting that followed produced no clean resolution. Battles such as Pollentia and Verona were later claimed as victories by both sides. The Goths were checked, but they were not destroyed, and they remained a living threat. The most lasting consequence of that campaign was not a decisive triumph, but a strategic relocation. The imperial court settled at Ravenna. Ravenna offered real advantages. Marshes and water made it difficult to approach. Its position gave access to food and routes across northern Italy, and the sea offered lifelines for supplies and troops. But the move also carried a political cost. It pulled the emperor even farther from the frontiers and from the provinces that expected imperial attention. The court became safer and more secluded at the same time. Outside the walls, Stilicho remained the active commander. Inside, Honorius remained the emperor who could be praised, displayed, and protected. For a period, the wider political environment appeared to stabilize. Relations between East and West, often poisonous in the late 390s, showed signs of easing in the early 400s. Consular arrangements and diplomatic signals suggested a partial thaw. At the same time, the most aggressive Western claims to supervise the Eastern court faded from the public line. That shift mattered because the Western regime could not function calmly while it was locked in open rivalry with Constantinople. Once tension eased, Stilicho's system had room to breathe. Then came the great performance of 404, the peak of the regime's self-confidence. Honorius marked his 6th consulship with a triumphal presence in Rome and celebrated a decade since his elevation. The ceremonial was designed for a powerful audience: the senatorial aristocracy, the city's leading families, and the political class whose cooperation mattered. The court also understood the city's internal balance. Traditionalist aristocrats still held influence, including figures with pagan sympathies, and the regime had reasons to avoid unnecessary confrontation while presenting itself as stable and inclusive. High offices went to prominent men from different camps, an implicit reassurance that elite status still translated into access and honor. The visit included gestures aimed at Christian opinion as well. Honorius publicly enacted humility in a major basilica, performing reverence in a way that strengthened the image of an emperor guided by faith. Such moments did not merely express personal devotion. They were political theatre aimed at a Christian elite that was increasingly influential in Rome and Italy. The procession itself leaned heavily into spectacle. Honorius appeared in glittering dress, surrounded by armed riders and ceremonial force. The effect was to drape him in military atmosphere even though the battles belonged to others. The crowd saw youth, wealth, and authority fused into one moving display. The Senate was given its own share of the drama. The emperor was presented as accessible, willing to honor tradition, willing to treat the fathers of the city with respect. This was how an adventus was supposed to work. It refreshed the bond between ruler and aristocracy through pageantry, but the partnership still had to be justified. Stilicho was not presented as a secondary figure at the edge of the frame. He rode with the emperor. Public language praised him as the man who had trained the young ruler and made him capable of appearing as a governing presence. The claim was bold. Honorius could now summon citizens, speak in an official setting, explain policy, and direct state affairs in the presence of the Senate. The message was that a boy had become a ruler because a powerful guardian had shaped him. For nearly a decade, the arrangement had worked. Stilicho dominated appointments, protected the court, and built a durable network inside the administration. Even the number of officials who later fell when he fell suggests how deeply the system had been staffed, with people tied to him. Yet a major weakness remained. The marriage that was supposed to fuse the two houses produced no heir. Maria died without a child. That absence mattered more with each passing year. Without a grandson, Stilicho could not secure his position through dynasty. The relationship remained political rather than biological, and political bonds can break. After the triumph of 404, the pressure returned in a more dangerous form. Late 405 and 406 brought a new invasion led by Radagaisus, and the threat was enormous. Stilicho eventually contained and destroyed the force near Faesulae. The victory was loud, celebrated, and turned into monuments. Captives were absorbed into the Roman army or sold off in massive numbers. Once again, the regime could point to its protector and say, "The partnership still holds." But the West was not facing only one danger. The Rhine frontier cracked at the end of 406. Vandals, Alans, and Sueves crossed into Gaul. The reasons behind that movement have been argued ever since, but the timing is what mattered. The invasion hit, while the Western government was already strained. Worse, it was followed by political rupture in Britain, where successive usurpers were proclaimed. The most successful of them, Constantine III, crossed into Gaul in 407 and seized control of the prefecture. The central government attempted a counterstroke early in 408, sending an army under a Gothic commander, but the effort failed. The empire's western half was now dealing with invasions, a rebellion holding Gaul, and unresolved problems with the Visigoths. It was in this tightening spiral that Stilicho's approach to Alaric became explosive. At some point, Alaric shifted position and demanded payment for costs incurred under a previous understanding. Stilicho chose negotiation over immediate war. The decision forced a reckoning in Rome because the money would effectively come from the same elite whose loyalty the regime needed. In early 408, he brought the matter before the Senate. That meeting became a turning point. Senators debated whether to fight or pay. Stilicho argued that compensation was justified. In the end, the payment was approved, but the atmosphere was poisoned. One leading senator's remark captured the mood. The agreement felt like submission rather than peace. The line mattered because it expressed something deeper than frustration at a single payment. It hinted that the ruling class was starting to view Stilicho not as a protector, but as a master. And that fear rather than trust was driving compliance. Stilicho had used the Senate before as a shield, letting it take ownership of controversial decisions, so that anger would not land on the imperial court alone. The tactic had once helped him. Now it revealed his vulnerability. The state was asking too much, too often, while delivering too little certainty. Under such conditions, deference to tradition stopped being a strength and started looking like desperation. At the same moment, a personal change forced another political recalculation. Maria was dead. The first marriage had not produced an heir. Stilicho responded by marrying Honorius to his second daughter, Thermantia. The move was not romantic, it was structural. Without the father-in-law role, Stilicho risked being replaced by other advisors as the emperor aged. By binding the household again, he tried to preserve his hold and keep rivals away from the imperial ear. If a child resulted, the old dream of dynastic security could be revived. But by 408, time was short. Honorius was no longer a child. The language of youthful promise could not be stretched much further. The fall, when it came, did not happen because Stilicho lost one battle. It happened because the machinery that had protected him began to turn against him. Elite resentment, military unrest, and the emperor's growing desire to act independently all converged. After the Senate meeting, Stilicho planned to return to Ravenna to coordinate operations. Honorius decided to travel as well, supposedly to review troops and strengthen morale. Whether this was the emperor's own impulse or encouragement from others at court, it introduced a new risk for Stilicho. An emperor who stayed inside ceremonial limits could be managed. An emperor who began to insert himself into military affairs could disrupt the balance of the partnership. Signs of unrest among troops soon appeared. Arguments broke out. Warnings circulated that soldiers were already disaffected with Stilicho. The journey became tense. At one point, Stilicho was called back to deal with disorder among the escort. The regime's foundation had always depended on the army accepting his leadership. If that acceptance weakened, the entire structure shook. Then news arrived that Arcadius had died in the east, leaving a child as successor. The situation tempted both Honorius and Stilicho. The idea of travelling to Constantinople was raised, framed as a protective mission. The language was familiar. A young ruler needed loyal ministers, needed safety from court plotting. needed guardianship. But behind the language lay a conflict of interest. If Honorius left the west, Stilicho's position in Italy would become more dangerous, not less. His authority depended on the presence of the emperor whose name legitimized his command. With a usurper active in Gaul, the idea of the emperor leaving the west also carried real strategic risk. Stilicho argued against Honorius making the journey. The reasons were practical on the surface: expense, danger, and the threat of rebellion spreading if Italy was left without the imperial figurehead. But the deeper reason was obvious. The partnership could not function without the symbolic emperor at its centre. If Honorius moved east, Stilicho would be exposed in the west, and the house he had built might collapse. In the midst of this uncertainty, a palace official named Olympius seized the moment. He advanced through the court by exploiting fear. Rumours spread. Stilicho was said to be manipulating Alaric, draining the state, plotting against the emperor, and preparing to replace Honorius with his own son. The themes were carefully chosen. They echoed older stories about domineering generals and vulnerable emperors. They turned Stilicho's greatest strength, his proximity to the throne, into his most frightening threat. Nothing in the surviving accounts suggests that Honorius personally drove the sequence that ended Stilicho's life. The momentum came from inside the court, and the turning point arrived in mid-August. On August 13th, while the emperor was reviewing troops at Ticinum, a coordinated outbreak of violence erupted. The spark appears to have been a signal from Olympius. At once the soldiers surged into a frenzy and began cutting down senior officials in front of everyone around them. The names attached to the dead make the scale of the operation unmistakable. High officers connected to Gaul fell first, including men tied to the government's attempt to manage the crisis created by Constantine's seizure of authority beyond the Alps. Senior commanders and leading administrators in Italy were killed as well, and several of the most important ministers were hunted down after the first blows landed. The slaughter did not stop with a handful of targets. It rolled outward until virtually any recognizable figure of the state apparatus was at risk. This was not simply a riot, it was a decapitation strike. The number and rank of the victims shows that the intention was to smash the entire structure that had governed the West for more than a decade. The fact that so many posts had to be cleared in one burst of violence says something crucial about how the Western regime had been operating. Stilicho was not merely the most powerful man in Honorius's circle. He had placed loyal personnel throughout the senior offices, and the government had come to run through that network. Removing Stilicho alone would not have been enough if his machinery remained intact. The coup required dismantling the framework around him. The killings also exposed an uncomfortable reality for the emperor. These were not strangers whose faces he barely knew. They were the people who had staffed his adult life. The familiar officials who handled policy, finance, military command, and the daily flow of decisions. If the court's senior advisors travelled with the emperor, then the violence at Ticinum was possible precisely because so many key figures were concentrated in one moving cluster. The government, at least on this occasion, was not a static institution sitting safely in one capital. It was a travelling organism that followed the emperor. Once that organism was caught in the open, it could be destroyed in a single coordinated purge. The scene itself seems designed to break Honorius psychologically. Accounts describe killings unfolding near him, pleas made at his feet, and desperation that brought no mercy. The message was plain. Protection had evaporated, and the old order could not save its own men. In the confusion, Honorius withdrew to the palace, and at a later moment he is described stepping out into the city in stripped-down clothing, without the full regalia of state, trying to calm the troops directly. It is hard to know how much this reflected genuine initiative and how much was a brief, frightened attempt to seize control of chaos. Whatever the truth, it did not last. After that moment, authority slipped into the hands of the figure orchestrating events, and the emperor's role narrowed to survival. News reached Stilicho at Bononia while facts were still uncertain. At first, even his followers did not know whether Honorius had been killed. Some of the armed men with him, especially his allied troops, wanted to march immediately and punish the mutineers. Once it became clear the emperor was still alive, Stilicho chose restraint. He urged calm and started toward Ravenna. Yet as reports spread that Olympius had turned the emperor against him and that an arrest order was coming, Stilicho moved cautiously and sought sanctuary overnight in a church outside the city. The next morning, soldiers entered the church and swore before the bishop that they had been ordered to arrest him, not murder him. Stilicho allowed himself to be led out under guard. Then the story turns sharply. A second message arrived, reversing the earlier instruction and sentencing him to death as an enemy of the state. On 22nd August, he submitted without resistance, forbidding those around him to fight for him. Soon afterward, his son Eucharius was also killed. The collapse was not limited to one man. It was meant to erase a political household. The aftermath carried immediate military consequences. Many of the non-Roman allies who had served with Stilicho now saw the bond as broken. Their loyalty had been to a commander who paid them, led them, and protected their status. With him gone, and with the Roman court suddenly hostile, large numbers drifted toward Alaric. The result was not only a change in palace politics, but a transfer of armed manpower into the hands of a rival force that would soon press Italy again. The scale of crisis required to bring Stilicho down matters as much as the execution itself. Even after major victories, the Western government was still under strain. The invasion across the Rhine remained unresolved. The revolt in Gaul had not been contained. The unresolved dealings with the Visigoths created political poison at home. Senatorial cooperation was fraying. Multiple emergencies stacked on top of one another until the regime's leader was forced away from the court, managing military problems in the field while opponents worked on the emperor in his absence. This is the key point. Stilicho's fall was not simply the product of one invasion or one bad decision. The decisive vulnerability was separation. His authority depended on controlling access to Honorius and shaping the emperor's environment. A minister who could keep the emperor close could contain rival voices, absorb shocks, and prevent the palace from turning hostile. In 408, that control failed. The court became the battlefield, and Stilicho was not present to fight there. It is not impossible that the system might have recovered under different conditions. If the payment to Alaric had been managed without igniting elite resentment, and if Gothic forces had been redirected effectively against Constantine's regime, a temporary stabilization might have followed. But stabilization required a stable court. Once Olympius gained room to operate, rumour became a weapon. The accusation that Stilicho was preparing to replace Honorius with his own son was especially lethal because it transformed a long-standing partnership into a story of impending usurpation. It recast the Guardian as a threat and made preemptive violence look like defense of the dynasty. For all his dominance, Stilicho never solved the fundamental problem that haunted any non-imperial manager of an emperor: indispensability. He had built a government around himself, filled offices with his people, and bound himself to the dynasty through marriage. But he could not secure the future in a way that permanently removed fear. A grandson heir would have made him far harder to dislodge, because the stability of the imperial line would then be linked to his own household. That outcome never arrived. Without it, his only reliable protection was proximity, influence, and a court that stayed under his management. This also explains a striking feature of the coup. It targeted the proven commander rather than the emperor. Honorius survived because he remained the irreplaceable piece. He was the legal and dynastic shield behind which power could be exercised. The system had trained elites to accept that the emperor could be passive while the real work was done by a dominant figure at court. That arrangement did not die with Stilicho. It simply transferred to new hands once the old manager had been removed. Contemporary moral judgments later followed the same logic. Critics could describe the emperors as personally devout, while blaming the disasters of the age on the men who ran the machinery around them. Stilicho's enemies, and later some commentators, could frame him as the one who armed the empire's foes through deals and payments. Whether fair or not, that kind of blame fits the political reality. The manager, not the emperor, was seen as the active agent responsible for outcomes. By August 408, Honorius was 23. Stilicho's fall had happened around him rather than because of him. The emperor's part was largely passive. He accepted what the new power at court demanded, and the machinery moved. That moment could have marked a turning point. With Stilicho gone, the adult emperor finally had room to seize control and govern directly. Yet nothing suggests that he tried. Instead of stepping into the empty space, Honorius allowed it to remain empty until someone else filled it. There was no clear attempt to become the driving force of his own government. The court drifted, waiting for the next strong figure to take the position Stilicho had held for so long. That hesitation mattered, because the Western state was already under strain. Removing the regime's most effective organizer did not calm the situation. It exposed how fragile it had become. What followed was a fast, unstable cycle. Ambitious ministers rose quickly, imposed new policies, then fell just as quickly. Each shift changed priorities, alliances, and strategy. Instead of steady direction, the government lurched from one approach to another. The pressures on the frontiers and inside the provinces did not ease. In several ways, they intensified, because the one man who had kept the system functioning had been eliminated. One notorious result of this inconsistency was the refusal to honour agreements, whether made with allies, rivals, or enemies. The cost of that unreliability would be paid in 410 when Alaric's army entered Rome. Honorius's inertia after Stilicho's death also revealed something about the previous 13 years. From 395 to 408, the Western regime had often been presented as a partnership. The emperor as the legitimate figurehead, and the general as the active hand. Once the active hand was removed, the figurehead did not transform into a leader. That gap made it hard to pretend that the arrangement had ever been anything other than shared rule in name and delegated rule in practice. It also encouraged a dangerous lesson inside the court, that the safest way to manage a ruler raised from childhood as a ceremonial presence was to keep pairing him with a dominant operator, even after he reached adulthood. That model, however, contained a built-in risk. It relied on the emperor's willingness to keep accepting the arrangement. Honorius's personal abilities remain difficult to measure. The sources do not allow a clear psychological portrait. It is possible he lacked the capacity or confidence to exercise independent command. It is also possible that years of staged ritual, carefully controlled audiences, and public appearances had trained him for symbolism rather than decision-making, leaving him uncertain when the controlling structure vanished. Another explanation is colder and more calculating. Recent history offered grim examples of young emperors who tried to shift from ceremonial status into real power and paid for it. Honorius may have concluded that survival depended on avoiding initiative. if rival factions were going to fight over control of the palace. Letting them collide while the emperor remained still could be the safest strategy. After Stilicho's execution, the first man to seize the centre of power moved with speed and brutality. The aim was not simply to replace a leader, but to erase a system. Court offices and appointments were brought under new control, mirroring the way Stilicho had once dominated access to power. A search began for anyone who might still carry loyalty to the fallen regime. Interrogations were used to force accusations and confessions. The effort to manufacture proof was relentless, even when victims refused to provide the desired admissions under extreme pressure. Rewards were distributed to those who had helped bring down Stilicho. The man who carried out the execution received a coveted command, while associates of Stilicho were removed and in several cases killed. Those who had participated in eliminating Stilicho's son were compensated with positions in the new order. The emperor was also pushed to abandon his newest marriage tie to Stilicho's family, severing the last formal connection that could remind anyone of the old partnership. Public messaging followed quickly. New official language cast Stilicho as an enemy of the state and treated his supporters as criminals. Their property was seized for the imperial treasury. Rules were issued to deny them access to the court and to Rome itself, cutting off appeals, petitions, and legal recovery. These measures were not only punishment, they were a strategy. Keeping former insiders away from the emperor increased the emperor's dependence on the new circle around him. Isolation became a method of control. At the same time, the court signalled a shift in foreign posture. Steps were taken to ease tensions with the Eastern government. Restrictions that had been put in place during the previous regime were lifted, and the change was presented as a return to normal relations. Even here, the pattern repeated. The person guiding policy mattered as much as the emperor's own will, because the emperor was not acting as an independent strategist. Yet the new government did not rule with an entirely new staff. Several leading aristocrats accepted office under the post-Stilicho regime, including men with deep family networks and previous experience of power. Their willingness to serve did not necessarily mean enthusiasm. It reflected political realism. In a world where careers depended on court favour, refusing high office could be dangerous. Elite allegiance continued to follow access to authority and the benefits it could distribute. The new ministers also tried to stabilise support in Italy by offering financial concessions and easing burdens that had caused resentment under the previous regime's military spending. Religious policy also became more visible. Honorius had long been presented as pious, and earlier proclamations had reinforced the privileges of the Church. After 408, however, religious legislation appeared more frequently and more emphatically. This had a political purpose as well as a religious one. With the court shaken by violence and rapid turnover, public emphasis on divine favour helped rebuild legitimacy. If the emperor could be shown as protected by heaven, then the regime could claim continuity, even while personnel changed. One episode in North Africa captures the atmosphere created by Stilicho's death. In a town where tensions between Christian and traditional civic celebrations ran hot, violence erupted after a bishop tried to disrupt a procession. The situation spiraled into riots, a killing, and the destruction of church property. Local authorities failed to respond effectively. What makes this event especially revealing is the interpretation that spread alongside it. People began acting as if laws passed under the previous regime no longer counted. The moment a powerful minister died, the validity of policy itself seemed uncertain. That perception tells its own story about who was believed to be in charge. A leading African bishop took the case to the imperial court, appealing directly to the new strongman there. The letter that accompanied the mission carried a blunt message. Opponents of church policy claimed that earlier laws had been issued without the emperor's true consent, and they used that claim to justify violence. The appeal demanded a clear demonstration that the emperor's authority stood behind those measures. In other words, it treated the regime change as a moment when the emperor had to prove that decisions were truly his. The fact that such an argument made sense to audiences far from Italy shows how widely the empire understood the reality of court power. Ministers came and went. The emperor remained. But many people believed policy depended on the minister. While religious messaging intensified, the core military crisis did not disappear. Stilicho's death solved nothing about the threats facing the West. A new regime still had to face the Visigoths under Alaric, other invading groups, and the rival Imperial centre in Gaul. The most immediate danger was inside Italy itself, and it demanded quick, coherent action. Alaric, despite the swelling of his forces with angry former allies of Stilicho, still explored the possibility of settlement. He offered to withdraw in exchange for payments and hostages. The court refused. The refusal was not followed by a decisive military strike either. The result was paralysis, neither peace nor war. With no agreement and no effective counterattack, Alaric marched on Rome. His first siege began late, in 408. What followed over the next 2 years became a grim cycle of pressure, bargaining, and breakdown. Demands were made, then reduced. Delegations travelled between Rome and the court, growing more desperate as conditions inside the city worsened. The Senate negotiated on behalf of a starving population, while Ravenna provided little and effective relief. The court hesitated, reversed course, and delayed. Alaric tried multiple approaches to force a settlement, including the creation of a rival emperor chosen from the Roman elite, intended as a usable figurehead. Even that gambit did not break Ravenna's resistance. At last, in August 410, Rome was sacked. The city's wealth was looted and the emperor's sister was taken. Soon after, Alaric died and leadership passed to his successor, who moved the Gothic host and its high-value captive toward Gaul. Back at Ravenna, the same pattern continued. Regime changes in rapid succession. The first dominant minister fell from power within months. His replacement installed his own network and tried to negotiate, then shifted alignment when negotiations failed. Another replacement followed. Those who lost the struggle did not fade quietly. They were expelled, disgraced, or destroyed. The emperor remained insulated and intact, while the men who claimed the right to act in his name burned out one after another. That sequence underlined the strength of the system Stilicho had created. It had established the office of the man beside the throne as a prize, and after Stilicho's death, multiple rivals fought to occupy it. The sack of Rome also exposed deep fractures between imperial and senatorial interests. The Senate had been forced to deal directly with an enemy army because the court would not provide timely protection. Treaties negotiated under pressure were not ratified. Delegations to Ravenna were rejected or ignored. When Rome finally accepted the demand to proclaim a new emperor, it was partly because it felt abandoned. The choice of an adult senator as rival ruler carried its own symbolism. It pointed away from child succession and toward a leader who did not depend on guardians. Even so, the new emperor was meant to serve as a ceremonial tool, not a true commander, which only reinforces the irony. The empire was trapped in the politics of figureheads, while real power was contested elsewhere. Through all of this, Honorius did not emerge as an active decision-maker. He did not take the opportunity presented by Stilicho's death to become the central force of his own state. The result was inconsistency. And inconsistency proved fatal in an age of crisis. Powerful subjects who expected protection discovered that the priorities of court factions could diverge sharply from the needs of the provinces and even from the needs of Italy itself. That gap is a structural weakness of figurehead rule. When the emperor does not command, policy reflects the ambitions and fears of ministers, not the broader interests of the realm. Even after Stilicho's execution, Italy's most visible danger remained the same. The Visigoths were still inside the peninsula, still a constant pressure point. But another crisis had been growing in the background, and Stilicho's death made it worse rather than better. In Gaul, Constantine III had built a rival power base that the court at Ravenna could not simply sweep aside. Before 408, there had been at least a rough plan forming. Stilicho had been gathering forces in northern Italy and may have hoped to turn the Visigoths into a tool, pushing them against Constantine's regime in the west. That idea collapsed the moment Stilicho was removed. Relations with the Visigoths deteriorated fast, and any possibility of using them as a controlled weapon disappeared with him. By early 409, Constantine moved from military success to political bargaining. He sent envoys to Ravenna insisting that he had not sought the purple, that soldiers had forced the title on him, and that he wanted pardon and recognition. The message was carefully shaped. It offered the emperor a way to save face while quietly admitting what everyone already knew. Constantine held the stronger hand. Ravenna lacked the troops and the money to launch a full campaign against a settled rival in Gaul. Honorius had little room to negotiate. The court effectively accepted the arrangement, sending the symbols of imperial office to its rival and granting him a formal place in the hierarchy. It was not an equal partnership born of goodwill. It was recognition wrung out by circumstance. For a time, the agreement held. Then, in early 410, Constantine made a move that could not be ignored. He started toward Italy, claiming that he meant to assist Honorius against the Visigoths. On the surface, the offer sounded plausible. Removing Honorius entirely would have risked provoking intervention from the Eastern Court, and Constantine may have calculated that cooperation could be safer than conquest. But the march carried an unmistakable warning. A rival emperor was now close enough to dictate terms face to face. That plan unraveled before it reached its goal. Constantine's own command structure began to crack. In Spain, one of his leading generals turned against him and promoted a new pretender. Constantine abandoned the Italian expedition and hurried back toward his base at Arles. The timing is telling. Back in Italy, another court faction was collapsing, and the overlap between these upheavals has raised suspicions that Constantine may have expected help from allies inside Honorius's circle. Whether or not that link was real, Constantine's retreat brought Honorius a breath of luck. The rebellion in Spain fractured the usurper's forces and reduced the immediate pressure on Ravenna. Still, the broader pattern remained bleak. The court was paralyzed by internal struggle. One group replaced another, then fell, then was replaced again. In the short term, Honorius survived precisely because he remained a symbol, rather than a commander. Rivals fought for influence around him, and when they lost, they paid the price. But that same passivity carried long-term risks. Each new clique brought new policies, new grudges and new priorities. And the empire's crises did not wait for court politics to settle. The Visigoths remained a threat, Gaul remained unstable, and the emergencies that had helped destroy Stilicho's regime were still unresolved years later. Out of that revolving door, a new figure finally emerged, around 410 or 411, Flavius Constantius. Unlike the civilian power brokers who had come and gone, he was a professional soldier. He likely arrived in the West with imperial armies years earlier and built a career inside the military structures that Stilicho once dominated. The exact route of his rise is unclear, but his arrival marks a change in the tone of the regime. This was not another court manager, living by intrigue alone. This was a commander who would try to restore control through campaigns. Constantius took command of the Western army and moved against the usurpers in Gaul. The era of reluctant coexistence with Constantine III ended. A strong general with his own future ambitions could not tolerate a rival emperor with an established state and a dynastic plan. Over the course of 411, Constantius conducted a hard, decisive operation. Constantine was trapped and besieged at Arles. At the same time, the rebel general who had broken away from Constantine's camp was also destroyed, and Constantine's son was eliminated before Constantius even reached the final stage of the campaign. Honorius's government, after years of humiliation and chaos, finally won a clear victory in Gaul. The victory did not end the story immediately. Late in 411, another claimant appeared. Jovinus, a noble with strong backing among groups settled near the frontier. His rise shows something crucial about the mood in Gaul. The region had lived through years of neglect, competing authorities, and shifting loyalties. Some elites had already served under Constantine, and they were willing to serve again under whoever offered protection and access to power. Jovinus's coalition was unstable, torn by rivalries among his supporters and by leadership miscalculations inside his camp. Athaulf, now leading the Visigoths in Gaul, eventually turned against the usurpation and delivered Jovinus and his brother into Roman hands. Both were executed, and a number of prominent supporters were swept away with them. This episode matters for more than the battlefield result. It reveals a political reality in Gaul. Many landowners and officials no longer felt naturally bound to a distant court in Ravenna. They adapted to whoever was closest and strongest, whether Roman, rebel, or barbarian. It wasn't always ideological betrayal. Often it was survival. Refusing office under a dominant local regime could be dangerous, and accepting could be the only path to protect family, estates, and networks. Even when Honorius survived in Italy, the repeated crises and palace struggles had damaged loyalty in the provinces. Constantius's successes changed that balance. Military victories gave him a secure position at court that earlier ministers lacked. They also confirmed an old rule. In a system built around a ceremonial emperor, the strongest claim to authority belonged to the person who could actually command armies and win. The partnership model that Stilicho had perfected did not disappear with him. It simply changed hands. Honorius stayed the symbol. Constantius became the active partner. In 413, another shock hit the system. The commander in Africa, the same man who had once been rewarded for loyalty to the court, withheld grain shipments and then sailed toward Italy with armed force. The rebellion ended quickly. He was defeated, fled back to Carthage, and was executed. Yet the very fact that Africa could attempt such a move shows the atmosphere at Ravenna. Power was concentrated, contested, and unstable. With Constantius rising, other major figures may have felt threatened. Even from across the sea, the attraction of becoming the man beside the throne was obvious, and so was the danger of being on the wrong side of the new order. After the rebellion collapsed, the estates of the defeated man were absorbed by the winner, strengthening Constantius further. While Gaul was being stabilized, the Visigoth problem remained, now shifted into a new phase. After helping bring down Jovinus, Athaulf reopened contact with Ravenna. The court, however, struggled to meet his demands, especially as grain shortages deepened. Then, Atholf took a step that changed the political landscape. He married Galla Placidia, the emperor's sister. The wedding was staged with deliberate symbolism. Roman ceremony, Roman songs, Roman aristocratic participation, and Atholf dressed not as an outsider, but as a Roman-style commander. The message was unmistakable. He was no longer behaving like a raider seeking loot. He was presenting himself as a man who could operate inside the Roman world and reshape it. Local nobles in Gaul played along. That willingness was not accidental. It reflected how abandoned many felt by Ravenna and how practical they had become. Working with the Visigoths or with earlier usurpers could seem more useful than waiting for distant help that never arrived. Landed wealth needed protection. Local influence needed a patron nearby. In this environment, authority was drifting closer to home, and the emperor's role, already ceremonial in practice, was becoming even more remote. For Ravenna, the marriage crossed a line. Constantius moved against Atholf with strategy rather than pitched battle, sealing off the coastline and choking supply routes. Under pressure, the Visigoths withdrew towards Spain. Atholf tried to defy Ravenna by raising a puppet emperor again, but blockade warfare squeezed his followers, damaged his standing, and fed internal tension. He was killed in a coup not long after. His successor, Wallia, chose negotiation over defiance. In 416, a settlement was finally reached. Placidia was returned. The Visigoths received a massive grain payment, and in exchange they agreed to fight Roman enemies in Spain on Rome's behalf. It was another victory for Constantius, and it tightened his grip on the government. By the later 410s, Constantius had done something remarkable. He had broken major usurpations, restored a measure of order in Gaul, and forced the Visigoths into a position where they could be used as a weapon, rather than feared as an unpredictable threat. What makes that achievement more striking is the weakness of the West's resources. The field army was far smaller than it had been decades earlier, and many new units were not new at all, simply frontier garrisons reclassified and pulled into mobile service, leaving other borders thinner. Money was just as scarce. Italy had been battered by years of war and occupation. Tax burdens were reduced because whole regions were struggling to recover, and provinces like Gaul and Spain had spent years outside effective imperial control, generating little revenue for Ravenna. Even with victories, consolidation demanded compromise. Some territories were never truly recovered. Britain and parts of the northwest faded from imperial reach. In 418, the Visigoths were settled in southern Gaul after their campaigns in Spain. The decision was a calculated one, designed from a position of strength, placing a dangerous force where it could be monitored and used against other threats if needed. Yet, it also meant that another slice of the Western world was no longer fully inside the old revenue system. Constantius also understood something Stilicho had understood. Military victories alone were not enough. The aristocracy mattered. Rebuilding loyalty required visible bridges between court and elite society. Young senators from famous families were brought into high financial and urban offices. Senior aristocrats were given major prefectures. Gallic figures appeared in central positions, signalling that Ravenna was no longer treating Gaul as merely a distant zone to be managed by outsiders. In Gaul itself, one of the most important moves came in 418. An annual council was established at Arles, drawing delegates from cities and provinces under the authority of the regional prefect. It offered local landowners a formal space to raise concerns and negotiate. The council served two purposes at once. It reassured elites that they had a voice, and it pulled their loyalties back toward the central government after years in which many had served rebels or accommodated barbarian power. The shift became visible in staffing too. More Gallic aristocrats began holding the top administrative post in their own region instead of Italians being sent north to rule them. And after Jovinus, Gaul did not produce another major usurpation for some time. That quiet was not an accident. It was the result of victories, bargains, and a deliberate effort to make the provinces feel connected again to a government that had seemed distant and unreliable. By the time Honorius was no longer a child, his reign still depended on a role he could perform without commanding armies: ceremony, religion, and the public image of legitimate rule. Court writers had long built his identity around appearances. Grand entrances into cities, formal celebrations, and carefully staged scenes that turned a young ruler into a figure of authority even when real decisions were being made by others. From early on, public spectacle was not a decorative extra. It was the mechanism that kept the system believable. There is a revealing example from a ceremonial arrival at Milan late in the 390s. The emperor is described less like a political leader and more like a sacred object carried by soldiers, shining in ritual clothing and treated as a living symbol of divine favor. That kind of imagery mattered because it did double work. It made the boy's rule seem sanctioned from above, and it protected the man actually running the government, first Stilicho, later others, by wrapping the regime in a religious aura. As Honorius grew into an adult and remained largely inactive, that sacred framing did not fade. Churchmen and historians continued to explain survival and success as proof that the ruler enjoyed special protection. Even distant observers repeated the same idea. Rival claimants might rise, plots might spread, crises might multiply, yet the emperor endured in ways that seemed to confirm heaven's support. The Western court was not alone in promoting that message. Similar language was used in the East, so the concept of a divinely favoured Christian emperor became part of imperial common sense across the Roman world. Visual propaganda carried the point even more effectively than words. Around the middle of the first decade of the 5th century, one remarkable ivory panel presents Honorius dressed as a warrior, even though he had never fought in a campaign. The image pairs military costume with Christian victory language, as if to say that conquest comes through faith rather than personal combat. In that period, official art usually kept religious signs in the background, but here, Christian symbolism stands front and centre. The timing is suggestive. It may have been meant to celebrate a victory won by the general in the field, yet credited to the emperor whose name and legitimacy framed the war. Coins told the same story. From childhood onward, Honorius was repeatedly shown wearing armour, cloaks, helmets, and carrying weapons. Later issues emphasize Christian power even more strongly, presenting him as the ruler whose authority is validated from above, and whose enemies fall beneath him. Whether those images appeared just before or after the fall of Stilicho, they fit the same political need: to reassure the public that the emperor's position was firm at a time of military danger and dynastic uncertainty, especially after the death of his brother in the east. Accounts of grand ceremonies from the later reign are scarce, but there are flashes that show the old style continued. Even when others fought, the emperor could still preside over rituals that looked like victory, justice, and renewal. A defeated rival could be paraded and punished. A journey to Rome could be staged as a sign that the ancient capital still mattered. In these performances, the traditional claim remained intact. The emperor brings victory, even if he never rides to war. That was not accidental. It kept the partnership model working. If the general and minister were the active arm of government, then the emperor's value lay in legitimacy, ceremony, and the spiritual guarantee that victories won in his name were part of a divinely ordered story. Religion was central to this image, and the law code became one of its main tools. From the later 400s onward, the volume of rulings on church matters grows noticeably. The empire was under strain, and the court answered in a way that made a clear statement. The emperor remained God's chosen ruler, protecting the state by guarding the faith. Earlier measures had often been cautious and limited. Later measures became broader, more confident, and more insistent about discipline, doctrine, church authority, and the handling of rival Christian groups. At times, the turbulence of events produced contradictory decisions, including a short-lived move toward wider tolerance that was soon reversed. But the overall direction is consistent. Religion offered a field in which an emperor who avoided war could still act as emperor. Many of these rulings were triggered by petitions rather than sudden inspiration. Delegations travelled constantly to the court seeking confirmations, punishments, reversals, or restatements of previous decisions. This traffic became so common that church leaders tried to control it, pushing disputes to be filtered through Rome before they were allowed to reach the imperial court. That arrangement served both sides. The court reduced the number of conflicts landing at its doorstep, and the Bishop of Rome gained leverage by controlling access. It also meant that when a crisis erupted, riots, violence, contested elections, Honorius could be seen doing something meaningful, issuing decisions that reinforced order, orthodoxy, and the idea of a realm protected by correct belief. North Africa provides a clear example of how far this went. The state moved toward harsh classification and punishment of dissident groups, and eventually demanded formal councils and debates that ended with sweeping rulings, followed by penalties for those who refused compliance. In another famous controversy, teachings associated with Pelagius were condemned after conflicting judgments across different regions and church leaders. These actions presented the emperor as guardian of religious unity, and therefore guardian of stability. Even the emperor's disputes with his brother in the east could be framed in religious language. When church leaders were mistreated or exiled in Constantinople, Honorius's court protested in terms that made him sound like an elder statesman, defending the proper order of church and empire. He insisted that bishops should handle doctrine while emperors enforce religious obedience, a convenient formulation that allowed him to claim moral authority without requiring personal military leadership. Public piety also took architectural form, and one project stands out: a dynastic mausoleum attached to the great shrine of St. Peter in Rome. The dating is uncertain, but it appears to belong to the early 5th century. For generations, emperors had been buried far from Rome, and the East had developed a powerful tradition of imperial burial linked to a major church in Constantinople. The West lacked a comparable Christian dynastic centre. Establishing an imperial burial place at the most prestigious martyr shrine in Rome was therefore a statement with multiple audiences in mind. It signalled renewed attention to the old capital, linked the imperial family directly to an apostolic sanctuary, and may even have been a quiet challenge to the Eastern court's prestige. Later discoveries during rebuilding work at St. Peter's revealed that Honorius's first wife, Maria, had been buried there with extraordinary wealth. Other imperial burials were found nearby, though not all could be identified. Records from later centuries state that Honorius himself was eventually laid to rest there as well. The details matter because they show how imperial Christianity could be made visible in a spectacular way. Funeral processions, lavish gifts, sacred space, and the theatre of a shrine that could turn dynastic memory into public religion. Long before popes regularly chose to be buried there, the imperial household had already made the Vatican Hill a stage for its own sacred legitimacy. All of this explains why the system endured as long as it did. By the early 5th century, Christian piety had become a guarantee of continuity and respectability for Roman rulers. For a child emperor, and for an adult emperor who remained passive, that guarantee was not merely useful, it was essential. Honorius may not have been a public presence in church services after the very beginning of his reign. Yet, he did not need to be. Law, ceremony, official imagery, and major building projects could broadcast devotion just as effectively. While Honorius performed this symbolic and religious role, the active side of government shifted to the general who could win. In the aftermath of years of crisis, Constantius rose as the commander, who restored a measure of stability. His method echoed Stilicho's in the broadest sense. Success in war, then a tighter grip on the court. Then, a deeper bond with the dynasty through marriage. After victories in Gaul, Constantius received the honours that signalled a man moving beyond in ordinary command. Repeated consulships elevated him above the usual ranks. A high court title, still unusual for a general, marked him as more than a battlefield officer. Even official art began to pose him in ways that looked uncomfortably close to imperial authority, with defeated enemies placed beneath him. The decisive step came when he married Galla Placidia. This marriage had enormous political value. Placidia was not merely a princess, she was the most powerful marital prize in the West. Leaving her unattached meant leaving open the possibility that a rival could gain privileged access to the court and threaten Constantius's dominance. The marriage also pointed toward the one thing Honorius lacked: an heir. Placidia was still young enough to bear children, and in a dynasty built on bloodline legitimacy, producing the next emperor was the closest any minister could come to becoming indispensable. Children came quickly. First a daughter, then a son, Valentinian, who could be presented as the future of the Western House. With that birth, Constantius's position became stronger than Stilicho's had ever been. Stilicho had tried to anchor himself through a daughter's marriage and hoped for a grandson who never arrived. Constantius secured the bloodline itself. Once the heir existed, the partnership could be reinvented again. Not merely a general serving a legitimate ruler, but a family man whose household now contained the next emperor. The honours followed in rapid succession. Another consulship, then, at last, elevation to co-emperor. Reports suggest Honorius did not welcome sharing the purple, but resistance could only go so far. Constantius's rise shows a careful calculation. It was safer to be raised through a formal act of the reigning emperor than to seize power through open force. A peaceful elevation preserved the sacred legitimacy that had been attached to Honorius since childhood and extended it to the new partner. Placidia received her own elevated status, and the infant heir was publicly marked out with titles that made his claim unmistakable. For a moment, the future looked unusually secure. 2 adult rulers, a dynastic successor and a state that had begun to recover from the worst chaos of the previous decade. It even seemed possible that the empire might avoid another long minority reign because the new heir had powerful adult protectors. When Flavius Constantius died, the calm he had forced onto the Western court began to dissolve almost immediately. A decade of victories and firm control had produced a government that looked stable from the outside, but it rested on one man's authority. Like many figures who climbed to the top in a closed political system, Constantius had not cultivated an obvious replacement. The safest successor, from his point of view, was not another ambitious adult, but his own small son. That meant the officials still in place during 421 were, for the most part, men shaped by his patronage and dependent on the order he had built. Once that order lost its architect, the court did not smoothly transition into a new phase. It reverted to a familiar pattern, sharp factions fighting for the space beside the throne. Honorius did not step forward to fill the gap. He had failed to do so after Stilicho's removal, and he did not do so again after Constantius. By this stage he was no novice, an emperor in his late 30s who had held the title for almost 3 decades. Yet the moment that should have marked a final shift from ceremonial ruler to active master of policy never arrived. Whether this was inability, calculation, or habit hardened into instinct, the result was the same. Power once more became something contested around him, rather than exercised by him. His sister, Galla Placidia, understood what this meant. With Constantius gone, the security of her children, especially her son, the only clear dynastic future available to the Western court, became dangerously uncertain. She tried to keep her brother close, to dominate access, to prevent rivals from isolating the emperor and turning him into a weapon against her. The attempt caused scandal and provoked backlash. In the atmosphere of suspicion that followed, enemies at court worked to poison Honorius against her. Her remaining bodyguard, men who had once served the Visigoths during her earlier years, became a convenient target. Disturbances in Ravenna were blamed on them, and the court's hostility reached a breaking point. Placidia and her children were pushed out of the western capital and sent east, to Constantinople, sometime around late 422 or early 423. The exile of the emperor's own sister, along with the removal of the only viable heir, shows how quickly the court returned to ruthless, short-term manoeuvring once the strong hand of Constantius disappeared. The final year of Honorius's reign becomes difficult to map with certainty because the sources are thinner and the power structure more unstable. Yet several military figures emerge as the most plausible contenders for influence. One was Asterius, a commander associated with operations in the far west, who had achieved real results against external enemies and even captured a former claimant. He seems to have risen quickly and then vanished from the record. Another was Castinus, sent on major campaigns and prominent enough to be considered a likely centre of authority. Then there was Boniface, who began alongside Castinus, but broke with him and withdrew to Africa. Boniface remained linked to Placidia's cause, supporting her from afar and positioning himself as a counterweight to the hostile circle at Ravenna. These men matter not simply as individuals, but because they show what the court had become. The contest for control repeatedly gravitated toward generals, because only military men could plausibly promise safety in an empire under constant pressure. Castinus, in particular, stands out as someone who may have gained from Placidia's removal. His later actions suggest that he was not merely an officer carrying out orders, but a player in the struggle for the throne's direction. Yet even those who succeeded in pushing Placidia aside did not get long to enjoy their victory. Honorius died in August 423, still relatively young, reportedly weakened by illness. Once again, the emperor survived every purge and factional storm around him, only to be claimed by natural causes. The ministers and generals who fought to control his government, by contrast, were far less safe. Looking back across the long arc of Honorius's reign, a clear pattern emerges. The Western Empire had been learning, often painfully, how to function under child rulers and figurehead emperors. Earlier generations had witnessed the dangers. A boy on the throne could invite civil conflict as rival power brokers arranged themselves around him or tried to replace him. Yet by the end of the 4th century, the system had started to adapt. A dynastically legitimate child could sometimes prevent open war by giving competing interests a single name to rally around, even if real authority rested elsewhere. That did not eliminate conflict. It redirected it inward into the palace and the court, where factions fought for proximity rather than marching rival armies against each other. Honorius came to power at the age of 10 and could not rule independently. The state continued to function because the late Roman bureaucracy and legal machinery could keep moving even when the emperor was young. That allowed the court to project normality. It also allowed ambitious men to treat the imperial office as something that could be managed, guarded, and used. From the beginning, religious language and dynastic loyalty were fused into a protective narrative. The young emperor was presented as pious, divinely endorsed, the rightful heir of a victorious father. The promise of youth became a political tool. It reassured key audiences while buying time for the real government to be conducted by others. Stilicho exploited that environment with exceptional skill. The regime he built depended on a partnership image. The child provided legitimacy and a sense of future, while the guardian provided experience, command, and results. Marital ties tightened the grip. Patronage filled offices with loyal men. Successes against crises, some real, some magnified by propaganda, kept the partnership plausible. Contemporary observers could see where power truly lay, and often complained that the emperors were rulers in name, while ministers enriched themselves. But those complaints did not break the system. Only a convergence of disasters did. Mounting military emergencies, political resentment among elite circles, and a ruthless court rival who exploited the moment when Stilicho was separated from the emperor. When Stilicho was eliminated in 408, Honorius was already in his 20s. The chance to rule personally was finally there. He declined it. Instead, he let new power seekers crash into one another and fall. That choice may have looked passive, even weak, but it was also survivable. Unlike earlier young emperors whose attempts at independence ended in violence, Honorius endured. The throne became a shelter behind which others fought, while he embodied continuity. Outside the inner circle, the emperor's mere presence could still suggest stability, even as policies changed rapidly and crises worsened. The cost, however, was severe. The court's internal warfare produced hesitation and inconsistency. Negotiations with enemies became erratic. Promises were made and abandoned. The empire's needs were often subordinated to factional advantage. The consequences were not abstract. Italy suffered, provinces drifted, and catastrophe could follow. Constantius restored a measure of order by repeating the same basic model, but with greater success. He won decisive campaigns, rebuilt ties with elites, and forced workable arrangements with hostile groups. He also achieved what Stilicho could not. He tied himself to the dynasty through marriage and produced a male heir, then finally reached co-emperorship through a formal elevation rather than naked seizure. That made the partnership structure stronger than ever. Honorius remained the ceremonially legitimate centre, while the active partner handled war and administration. The system had, in a sense, matured into a stable method of rule. Then Constantius died, and the weakness underneath the stability was exposed again. Honorius did not transform into an active ruler. The court returned to rivalry and suspicion. Placidia was expelled. Key military men took positions like chess pieces across the map. The emperor's death in 423 ended the long experiment of a child who never truly stopped being a figurehead. At that moment, the Western future was far away from Ravenna. The heir, still a small child, was in Constantinople with his mother and sister. If the West wanted a dynastic continuation, it would require enormous effort, men, money, political will, to bring the boy back and place him on the throne. The reputation of this next emperor would later be dragged down by hostile portraits and scandalous stories. Many judgments would brand him idle, careless, obsessed with pleasure, and unworthy of the imperial burden. Tax remissions granted during his reign would be portrayed as weakness, as if mercy and fiscal concession were simply failure. Yet such verdicts often ignore the political world that had been created before the boy ever wore a crown. By the time this new child entered the story, the Western imperial office had already been reshaped by decades of managed rule. The emperor's public function had become narrower, more ceremonial, more religious, more symbolic, while the active work of survival increasingly depended on a dominant general. That does not excuse later failures, but it changes what an effective emperor could realistically be inside that system. Actions that remain visible, law, church politics, arbitration of disputes, the public performance of legitimacy, gain a different weight when the office itself has been constrained. Understanding the next reign requires following events carefully through scattered evidence, laws preserved in codes, fragments of court poetry, brief notices in chronicles, and later narratives written from outside the Western experience. Those later voices often judge the West through the certainty of hindsight, knowing that the Western Empire would vanish within a few decades. But a closer view shows a more complicated picture. Even under severe strain, the Western state could still fight. Armies could still win battles. In many regions outside Africa, a partnership between emperor and general could still impose order for years at a time. By the 420s, the Western Empire was no longer treating a child on the throne as a temporary emergency. A full working model had formed, one that looked nothing like the older ideal of a single adult emperor directing everything himself. The new pattern relied on an arrangement that had become familiar at court. A young ruler who embodied legitimacy, and a dominant general who carried the burden of action. That partnership had become almost routine, an expected way for government to function when the emperor was too young to rule. Yet the path that led Aetius into the role of Valentinian, the third's chief manager, was not straightforward. Rivalry among powerful commanders was inevitable, because the court had learned to expect competition for the position beside the throne. But Aetius, becoming the man who ultimately prevailed, was not guaranteed. Another complication was the Eastern Empire. Constantinople did not simply launch Valentinian and then lose interest. Once the East decided to invest in him, as the Western future, it committed not only soldiers but administrative effort, long-term planning, and political capital. That meant Aetius, even at the height of his Western influence, would always have to operate under the shadow of Eastern involvement. The East had to tolerate his rise, but his dominance was never completely free from Eastern pressure. Valentinian III's rise to power itself shows how valuable child emperor rule had become in late Roman politics. The decision to place a very young boy on the Western throne was not merely a reflex of bloodline loyalty. It was a calculated choice made by experienced political actors who believed a child ruler could serve the state's needs if handled correctly. In 424, the Eastern government under Theodosius II chose to spend heavily to shape the West's future. Eastern involvement in Western affairs had precedents, costly interventions earlier in the empire's recent past, tense standoffs over Western military moves, and even emergency support sent when the West was under siege. But this time, the Eastern court acted for a different purpose. It intervened not to avenge a dead emperor, but to install a 5-year-old with a strong dynastic claim. For a court that counted resources carefully, that choice demands an explanation. By the time Valentinian became emperor in 425, the empire had decades of practice. Nearly 60 years had passed since the accession of young Gratian, and about 50 since the proclamation of Valentinian II as a small child. Across those decades, officials and officers had lived through minority regimes and learned how they worked. The Eastern Court had its own deep familiarity with the same phenomenon. Theodosius II himself had entered imperial life as an infant and spent his childhood under a managed government. His court understood, better than most, how to stabilize rule around a boy in purple. Even so, placing Valentinian on the Western throne would be harder and more expensive than previous child accessions. The fact that the East still chose to do it shows how far the system had evolved. Child emperor rule was no longer seen as fragile improvisation. It had become a usable tool of statecraft. Valentinian's background made him an obvious candidate once a decision was made. He was the son of Galla Placidia and Constantius III, linked directly to the ruling house. He had already been granted high rank while Honorius lived, but the family's position shifted rapidly. Constantius died, and Valentinian ended up in Constantinople with his mother and sister. The Eastern Court gave them refuge, yet it had not previously recognized all the Western titles Honorius had conferred on them. That earlier reluctance mattered, because it shows the East did not automatically treat the Western branch's internal decisions as binding. After Honorius died, the West did not remain leaderless for long. Without a visible Theodosian in Italy, a new regime emerged. The new ruler was John, a senior court official rather than a battlefield commander, proclaimed in Rome late in 423. Details of his short reign are uneven, but it is difficult to imagine a civilian figure holding power without strong backing from military interests. Support gathered around him from key Western commanders. Castinus aligned himself with the new regime, and Aetius, already influential at court and linked to the Western military world, also supported it. Some have treated Castinus backing a civilian usurper as proof that generals knew the throne itself was too dangerous, or that a soldier emperor was an exception rather than a trend. But the previous decades had been moving in a different direction. Constantius's elevation had not been a strange accident. It represented the peak of a partnership model that had been growing for a generation. Within that same logic, John may have been a deliberate compromise, an emperor who could serve as a ceremonial front, while military leaders competed for real leverage. Choosing a civilian could reduce the risk of open civil war between rival generals because it avoided elevating one commander above the others in a way that would provoke immediate resistance. The aim was familiar: preserve the balance that had worked before, with a symbolic emperor and a strong military partner. How far John's authority reached remains hard to measure. Signals from Italy itself are mixed. Though proclaimed in Rome, his court moved to Ravenna. Outside Italy, support appears even shakier. In Gaul, his top official was killed in unrest at Arles. In Africa, grain shipments may have been disrupted, suggesting resistance from key provincial powerholders. The larger lesson was already known from earlier crises. A figurehead emperor might suit the palace and some military factions, but not every regional interest group or aristocratic network. In the West especially, the relationship between a distant court and provincial elites could fracture quickly when policies failed to deliver protection. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine the Eastern Court instantly declaring for Valentinian the moment Honorius died. Accounts suggest Theodosius II did not immediately announce the Western emperor's death. The delay implies calculation. Honorius's death left Theodosius as the only reigning Augustus across the empire, and for a period he legislated as sole ruler. For months there was no public move to install a Western colleague. That pause matters. It shows that the East weighed its options, including the possibility of leaving the West without a separate emperor for longer than anyone expected. There is a popular dramatic reading that the Western imperial family in Constantinople must have feared for their lives during this delay. That interpretation does not fit the cold logic of imperial politics. If the Eastern court wanted to neutralize Valentinian, it could have kept him quietly in Constantinople, without bloodshed, scandal, or instability. Killing a child prince would have been a needless disaster in public perception. The more realistic explanation is simpler. The East hesitated because intervention would be expensive, risky, and uncertain. Speculation exists that the East initially explored some arrangement with Castinus, possibly expecting him to act as a kind of Western deputy, while remaining loyal to Constantinople. But the evidence for such a clean deal is weak. If Castinus expected an Eastern-backed partnership, events moved too fast for it to hold. John's proclamation came only months after Honorius's death. Whatever private approaches were made, the political reality in Italy hardened quickly into a new regime seeking recognition. The turning point came when John reached out to Constantinople for legitimacy. He had already tried to present himself as compatible with the Eastern Emperor by using imagery that associated both names. But the Eastern court refused to play along. John's envoys were arrested and removed from influence rather than welcomed as partners. That refusal revealed the limits of compromise. Theodosius could not easily control the West from Constantinople through a cooperative usurper. And if recognition was granted, the West might slip away permanently from dynastic oversight. It was at this stage, when the West looked as if it could be lost unless action was taken, that the Eastern court committed to Valentinian. Once the decision was made, the East moved quickly to formalize the Western family's position. Titles previously left in limbo were now validated. Imperial imagery began to honor Placidia. Recognition extended to Constantius after death. At the same time, a marriage alliance was arranged. Valentinian was betrothed to Theodosius II's young daughter, to be fulfilled when they were older. The logic was clear. If a child emperor was being installed at enormous cost, the new Western regime needed to remain tied to Constantinople. A future marriage offered a chain that would be political as well as familial. It also solved another recurring problem of the age. Imperial women could create dangerous rivals through marriage, because ambitious husbands could turn family ties into claims. A marriage between two imperial children avoided that risk. Valentinian was already part of the dynasty, destined for a throne, and therefore not a threat to Theodosius II's position. Few matches could have been safer for the Eastern Emperor's only daughter. With political groundwork laid, the East launched the expedition that would decide the Western throne. A major force set out, led by senior commanders, and it brought Placidia and her children along, an unmistakable sign that the campaign was not merely punitive, but constructive, designed to build a government. The army moved first to Thessalonica. There, in October 424, the 5-year-old Valentinian was formally invested as Caesar by a high Eastern official acting in the emperor's name. The gesture was layered with meaning. Valentinian was elevated, but not all the way. He was marked as junior, dependent, and made legitimate by Eastern authority. Public messaging reinforced that hierarchy. The senior emperor remained the source of power. The boy was the beneficiary. The campaign into Italy followed. In the spring of 425, the force split. One part moved by sea, another by land. A moment of crisis struck when the commander at sea was shipwrecked and captured. Some accounts frame what followed as providence, others as clever persuasion and political skill. Captors turned into allies. Danger transformed into opportunity. Meanwhile, the land force advanced, and Ravenna fell. The captive commander was freed, the usurper John was seized, and he was sent to Aquileia, where Placidia and her son awaited the outcome. John's fall was staged as a public lesson. He was displayed in humiliating fashion before being mutilated and executed in early summer 425. The performance was not only vengeance, it was a warning to future challengers and a signal to Italy that legitimate power had returned under Eastern sponsorship. A few months later, the expedition moved on to Rome, and there, in October 425, the boy who had been made Caesar a year earlier was raised to Augustus. Again, the ceremony was carried out by an Eastern representative. Choosing Rome as the stage was deliberate. The ceremony could have been done sooner, in Ravenna or Aquileia. Instead, the planners waited, and they chose the old imperial capital as the setting for full accession. That decision aimed at the Italian senatorial elite, whose support still mattered, and it echoed Eastern assumptions about how an emperor should be made, through controlled urban ceremony, not merely by military proclamation. Even without many surviving details of the event, exact location, full list of attendees, the precise sequence of ritual, it is clear the process was carefully designed. The pattern across 424 and 425 shows a government thinking in terms of spectacle, hierarchy, and legitimacy. There are strong hints of Constantinopolitan influence in how the new reign was presented. Staged promotions, ordered ceremonies, and public theatre that framed the transfer of power as lawful, divinely favoured, and anchored in tradition. The Eastern Emperor even considered travelling west to preside personally, which would have made the message of seniority even sharper, but illness forced him back. The celebration was not only Western. Constantinople marked the victory too. The campaign had restored a dynastic branch, reasserted Eastern influence, and removed a regime that had tried to negotiate legitimacy from the outside. The new order was presented as a triumph of lawful succession over improvisation, and the messaging continued after the coronation. Coins and public imagery emphasized joint imperial solidarity, while making the boy's subordinate status obvious. Even as Augustus, the child was depicted alongside the adult Eastern Emperor in a way that highlighted scale, seniority, and the source of authority. The message was consistent. The West had an emperor again, but his throne had been rebuilt through Eastern power. Valentinian's rise in the West was, in the clearest sense, a victory for the ruling dynasty. Yet the story was not only about bloodline. The Eastern court had hesitated before committing itself, and once it chose action, it paid an enormous price to make the change real. Removing an adult ruler who had military support and replacing him with a 5-year-old was a gamble, even in an age already familiar with child emperors. The fact that the Eastern leadership took the risk suggests a calculation that went beyond family loyalty. After establishing the Western regime, the Eastern government did not withdraw its influence. Having invested heavily in placing Valentinian III on the throne, Constantinople expected to shape the new administration. Eastern forces remained in the West. To secure the transition, Eastern officials supervised key ceremonial steps, and early military appointments likely reflected Eastern selection. The new Western government therefore began under strong Eastern direction, with cooperation between the two halves of the empire clearly unequal in balance. Because Valentinian was a child, real authority did not lie with the emperor himself. His mother, Galla Placidia, played an important public role, appearing in official imagery and representing dynastic continuity. But her formal power was limited. Her influence operated through court presence, wealth, and symbolic authority rather than constitutional control. Religious patronage and imperial imagery under her sponsorship emphasized divine protection and dynastic legitimacy, reinforcing the idea that the new regime represented continuity rather than foreign imposition. Valentinian's sister was also elevated to high rank, creating additional security for the dynasty in an uncertain political environment. At the same time, the Western government worked to secure support from Italy's powerful aristocracy. Policies reassured the Senate, protected elite privileges, and reduced financial burdens. Religious measures reinforced Christian legitimacy, while legal reforms presented the new regime as orderly and lawful. Over time, leading senatorial families gained major administrative offices, showing that cooperation with Roman elites remained essential for political stability. Yet the greatest challenge came from the military sphere. The rise of Aetius transformed Western politics. With strong connections to the Huns and access to external military support, he could not easily be controlled by the court. After a series of conflicts with rival commanders, shifting alliances, and repeated negotiations, Aetius emerged by the early 400s as the dominant military authority in the West. He did not seek the throne itself, but ruled as the essential commander behind a largely ceremonial emperor, reflecting a broader shift in imperial politics, where generals exercised real power while emperors embodied legitimacy. Eastern involvement continued throughout this period. Constantinople intervened in Western affairs, especially during the Vandal invasion of North Africa, and sought to reinforce its senior position through military cooperation, dynastic marriage, and legal initiatives, such as the Imperial Law Code. These actions emphasized Eastern authority and presented the West as a partner under guidance, rather than an equal power. Meanwhile, Aetius maintained his dominance through successful campaigns, particularly in Gaul, where he secured frontiers and gained widespread recognition as the empire's primary defender. Provincial appeals and foreign diplomacy increasingly treated him, rather than the emperor, as the figure capable of decisive action. His authority rested on military success, personal networks, and earlier alliances with the Huns, though the loss of Hun support later reduced his strategic leverage. By the 440s, the Western system had taken a clear shape. The emperor served as a symbol of dynastic and religious legitimacy. The Eastern court claimed senior authority over imperial unity, and Aetius functioned as the operational leader who ensured the empire's survival. This arrangement created a fragile balance of power. As Valentinian matured into adulthood, uncertainty grew over whether he would accept a ceremonial role or attempt to assert greater authority, raising tensions within a political system built on partnership rather than direct imperial rule.